Dear friends, a Merry Christmas. This is a wonderful story I am about to offer you. Nevertheless, it is a story from which only you can decide how it affects you. However, as it is Christmas Eve, time is not my friend tonight, for the day we have been anticipating is nearly upon us. Therefore, given this traditional occasion, let us commence in the time-honoured manner. Are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then I will begin. Once upon a time, in a place that includes where you are now, there were once two elderly sisters. Chapter 1. With the scent of violets hanging around her like an invisible mist, Miss Edwina Kent, a spinster of the parish, exited from Mr. Baldwin's perfume shop, a 15th century building of above average reputation. She tugged her dark tweed coat and scarf respectively around her chest and thin skeletal neck, rearranged her wide-brimmed bonnet so as to ensure a tighter fit over her coloured hair, and squarely faced the dark and oily yellow fog which enshrouded London. On toes yet to be blessed and gently roasted, she began the short journey back to her house by Clerkenwell Central on Christmas Eve in the year of our Lord 1881. Edwina was as underweight and as angular as a robin who had not eaten for a week. She possessed pale green eyes, a small sharp nose, thin colourless lips, tight hair, and narrow shoulders. From the moment she set foot upon the narrow pavements, dampness, by virtue of an oily yellow fog, began to accumulate on her coat, and immediately reddened her cheeks. Nearing retirement, and with a secretly imbibed brandy warming her blood and her belly, an after-work extravagance, she squinted and scented her way myopically through the warren of dark skeletal passages and streets known locally as Little England. Her principal form of illumination, for the gas had not yet been lit, was offered only by occasional candles which flamed in small side windows, and which temporarily illuminated the murkiness as she walked ever onwards, leaving a swirling cloud in the oily fog. Her white oak cane impatiently tapped the buildings to her left as she stuttered along, her mind the hub, on no one person, item, or place. She had been walking the same journey at the same time for 48 years, and it was safe to wager that her polished and clipped brown boots knew the way. Therefore, on she slipped and stumbled through the freezing, gloomy evening to the accompanying sights and sounds of Victorian mayhem, her sure-footed footsteps tapping, while the occasional Christmas carol strained into her ears from places warmer than where she was, physically, if not spiritually. A stranger or a companion would have certainly heard her muttering to herself as she whistled her way along the slender and slippery stone dark pathways, avoiding the many obstacles which lay in her path. However, although the effort of her journey could be likened to a well-oiled machine, her cane was not. It was too bright, too new, too fresh, and certainly did not match the outfit of the well-heeled lady driving it. There were no bruises, no marks of battle, damage, or grime. Although it was a few months old, even a clever observer would not have been able to gather much information, even if he or she had been allowed a closer examination of that particular piece of oak. For much of her 70 years she had witnessed the folly of the unfortunates of London, their animal-like joy, cruelty, pain, and love. As she had lived, breathed, worked, and grown old, she had witnessed Saturn's brutal death, and its opposite, sweet life born, acted noble and pitiless in turn, and seen seasons born and die like men, an endless and cruel kaleidoscope merry-go-round. Miss Edwina Kent was not immune to the lower levels of human poverty that lay in the gutter, and over which she now stumbled and passed. Nevertheless, as a humanitarian and a woman of means, she knew by the two sisters of instinct and intellect that she could do little for the wretches and drunken flunkies who lay huddled in the darkest of doorways. Give them a penny, and it would not go on food. Oh no, gin, gin, and more gin. She knew the way of them. Better to reinforce her efforts at social rehabilitation by the ways and means of the law than to attempt to change what personally refuses to change. It was by no coincidence, therefore, that she was president of the Dortington Committee and executive accountant of the Home for Wayward Girls and Women. She wore the badge of the Peculiar Society with pride, and those who considered her friend were aware that she spent a considerable amount of her free time occupied with an assortment of respectable and philanthropic deeds. Yes, she remembered witnessing those orphan souls and others similar to them at quite the same time last Christmas. The memory of them caused her to set her jaw, as she realized how little inroad her own physician's medicine was making on her eyes, and how the recently diagnosed malady, which was robbing her of sight, was affecting her with every passing day. How much worse her eyes had become in the past year, she reflected, for exactly 1 year ago she certainly had not needed her cane. Her physician, Dr. Blinder, had advised her to count her blessings, for, being self-employed, a publisher of Bibles, it ought to have been easy for her to transfer her rule over to her staff, 7 in all. Should have been. But it was not. It was her business, established with her money, and she did not wish to see it placed into lesser hands. Therefore, with the certainty which occurs to the elderly, in September of that year, as the summer breathed its last and left London to the developing iciness of winter, so did her eyesight, and she was forced to steer that cane around. Although usually content, yet well known for her funereal personality, her employees had secretly agreed gradually losing her sight had not increased her temperament. For now, as if to compensate, her nose had become far more acute and keener, and therefore she could smell the wretches lying around and before her, as well as improperly seeing them. She could hear the pitiful begging of the starving children, and, compounding her guilt, often walked by them quicker in order to get her thin and warmed belly home before that feeling evaporated too, as she wished to do that evening. The penetrating dark and distasteful fog touched every protective place around her ranky body, and haunting briefly to peer into a watchmaker's shop window, she drew her scarf once more around her neck, as tight as if it were a noose, as swift and random gusts of wind blew along the dark streets. Sweating and melodious horses pulling their carriages and dog carts, shouting costermongers, hawkers, huskers and peddlers, dustmen, nightmen, wicked frightening children, music from ballad singers, and the betraying sounds of drunken women, she ignored them all. Leaving the area containing the great Bartholomew Hospital behind, and with the distant drone of traffic signalling in from the vortex of the city by Farringdon Street, she advanced into Smithfield Market before turning west, passing one of the city's workhouses. If her eyesight had not become so poor, no grimmer sight in London would have met her gaze had she bothered to glance beyond the wrought iron gates which encompassed the wide courtyard of the dark and forbidding set of buildings. Through the wide and bare windows, hardly lit, she would have seen the rows of elderly, skeletal people that attempted to survive under a regimental and impossible discipline. Such a sight may have jolted her out of her cold complacency. She would have seen the futility, loneliness, and despair that were the inmates' constant companions. Empty of morals and incapable of adjustment, the separated men and women were profoundly resolute in their determination to remain as they were. Stopping briefly in Chick Lane before her local sweet shop, knowing it was there only from memory and odour, Miss Edwina Kent gently pushed a small, thin and shivering, washed-out dog away with her boot and entered the enticing shop. At once, a plethora of familiar sights, sweet smells and sounds surrounded her. Well-worn wooden cabinets containing all manner of tooth-decaying products such as humbugs, aniseed gums and butterscotch were laid out plentifully. Boxes of licorice and chocolates, each labelled with their factory of origin, were stacked from floor to ceiling, and to her right stood the largest and most wonderfully constructed brass scales she had ever seen outside of a warehouse. In several separate cabinets, and again laid out most handsomely and intricately, were paper bags of all sizes and large bottles of caramels. A fat black cat dozed sleepily by an open roaring fire in a hearth. This raised the temperature of the shop well above that of the glacial outside. Mr. John Parthenfall, a tall and bittersweet one-legged ex-soldier, glanced up from his penny paper and a sixpence worth of boiled hog and bread, and smiled respectfully as he brushed away crumbs from his worn brown leather apron. He was gifted with a wide brown moustache, and wore an expression that had seen too much of the cruelty of life when he had served his queen and country overseas. Surviving, losing his limb, by only a patient and kind nurse, he had been pensioned off, and with a small annuity granted by an elderly aunt, had opened his shop, and with the help of his wife ran it most successfully. Undoubtedly, his outgoing personality, plus a shrewd knowledge of the requirements of his customers, had ensured this. Therefore, without a moment's hesitation, he took up his wooden crutch and hurried across to greet his regular client, who, once the door closed, became as a statue as the sweet aroma of the small but well-stocked shop filled her nostrils. The intangible and distinctive odours certainly modified her briefly, and she steadied herself once more on her cane before shaking her shoulders in response to the warmth. "Why, Miss Kent, madam, season's greetings. What weather, what weather! How are you, madam?" Edwina gleamed dimly at him, recognizing only his voice and bleary moustache. "Better for getting home, Mr. Parthingfall. I have no desire to blather tonight." "I quite understand, madam. Why do you not take a cab?" "I have done the walk, sir, since I was a seasoned woman. I see no reason to change my habits." "Quite so, Miss Kent. As you wish. May I assist you this evening?" "7 of your Rickerish roots, Mr. Parthingfall, if you please, and 30 double sorts." "At once, madam." It was Miss Kent's pleasure to sit in the evening around her fire and suck the sweets. And why not? After all, she did not consider herself an imbiber, not by the amount that many Londoners appeared to consume. Moreover, as she often reminded herself, by means of a convincing round of unwise logic, a woman should have a minor vice, for that would prevent her from realizing a greater one. Mr. Parthingfall's gaunt and sugary perfumed fingers worked swiftly, and soon all 7 of the roots were safely ensconced in the reticule of his early evening customer. "Are you settling in for Christmas, Miss Kent?" "I am, Mr. Parthingfall, just myself." The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed with some slight incomprehension before he rattled Edwina's coins into his box. Although he was aware of his customer's home situation, the reality of it still had the power to stun a conversation, and there was a moment's lull. "Then I wish you a Merry Christmas, madam. I do hope that my little shop may be honoured with your custom in the coming year." Edwina leant heavily on her oak and peered into the depths of the gloomy shop, hoping to see beyond the image her invalid and diabetic eyes were offering her. 7 roots, Mr. Parthingfall, and 7 days. I'll be visiting before then." "Then good night to you, madam. Allow me to reach the door for you." Tugging her coat tightly around herself once more, Edwina turned left and walked on through the ever-deepening gloom. She passed Saffron Hill with much difficulty, for the traffic, though not impassably dense, moved with a rapidity bordering on the senseless, the many horses stamping unendingly. Only a far younger man, offering his services as Samaritan, saved the day. And soon after, she reached the crooked stairs with its crooked hand-rail that would take her up into Wood's Place. This was deserted except for a tradesman knocking on doors, hoping to end the day with a sale. Shuffling forward, she continued to bang her stick against each wall and each fence until she came to her house, number 7. A short time after those events, Miss Charlene Kent, twin sister, in appearance only, to Edwina, and a woman of milder temperament, dipped her silver pen in her silver ink pot for the last time that day and year. She completed adding together several columns of numbers, and then wrote their totals in the bottom of the 700th page of a huge and ancient ledger book that lay open before her. Correctly guessing the time, she rose, found her overcoat, scarf, hat and gloves, and bid an affectionate and festive farewell to the other voluntary staff that worked in their tiny office. She stepped, as her sister had previously, into the fog-laden fumes of, this time, West London, which the poor and destitute would be pleased to hear was of exactly the same density, colour, and odour as had descended on the east that week, the weather tediously not showing any respect for rank and division whatsoever. It being a Tuesday, Charlene had spent her day working, as she always did, for the benefit of the Mormont Trust, a London-based charity that dealt primarily with the gathering of funds in order to provide beds for the deserving and occasionally not so deserving poor. Her business life, having once consisted of accounting and now fully retired, she used her knowledge and time partly in the most commendable of ways by offering her expertise to those charitable companies who could not afford it. And because of her seasonal carol-singing group, which she had formed under the guidance of her local reverend, and the errands she undertook for the local residences even older than herself kept her busy at this time of the year, Charlene was thus well known for her pleasant and helpful disposition. When Miss Jarvis's King Charles spaniel had spotted a rat, and with some excitement broke his lead some weeks ago, who was it that ordered several dozen posters to be printed at her own expense, and moreover spent a morning pinning them to trees while looking for the Canis domesticus? Who was readily on the pavement ordering domestics to sweep and clear away snow, and paying grit to be tossed down every winter, despite being a woman who had excellent social standing? Who spent long hours organising old retainers to sweep piles of leaves together before they cluttered up the street and impeded the walk of ladies in the autumn? Who fed sugar lumps to the delivery horses? Moreover, stroked each and every cat in the street, wild or not? Who was the first to organise toys to the orphan children not 2 miles to the east? Yes, it was Miss Charlene Kent, naturally. A more wholesome, friendly, and splendid person you would not find in the whole of London. Excepting her sister, of course. Those who knew both of them imagined that in the privacy of a private conversation, each might attempt to outdo the other by way of philanthropic offerings. But that was not the case with the Kent sisters. However, some did wonder or debate the case of what would happen to the many poor old Londoners if they ceased what they were doing, or worse, moved away. Although it did not take her long to hail a cab that evening, it took Charlene far longer than her usual 20-minute journey back to Clerkenwell, for it seemed every person and their mother seemed to be on the streets, probably enjoying their last-minute Christmas shopping. She readily climbed into the cab's dark, icy upholstery away from the bitter wind, and sat back to enjoy the journey despite the odour of the horse's sweat and windy breakfast, which wafted around the cab into her thin nostrils. For much of their life, although identical in physical appearance, the march of time had now organised their bodies differently, for at their advanced age they now did not match, among other small details, whereupon Edwina sported an unnatural hair colouring through a weekly application of a tonic. Charlene allowed her grey to be natural. However, they both, in their middling years, had taken on their mother's soft skin. However, whether that was from good living or simply the way of things, it was difficult to ascertain. Stopping in traffic above the clatter of the horses stamping on the cobbles, a whistling of a contemporary favourite music hall tune sounded loud and caught the imagination of the frozen horseman, who began to hum it too. Snuggled up in the cab, Charlene began to smile and began to hum along gently as well. One could easily believe, had you heard it, that it could have been the happiest cab in old London town. Progress through Mayfair was slow because of the dense fog which flowed off the royal parks. Nevertheless, eventually, with the horse snorting noisily and pulling to a slippery halt outside her house, Charlene offered the aged driver, who had already been working for 12 hours, a substantial tip. Whereupon the grateful man readily touched the side of his cap in appreciation and wished her season's greetings before clattering off, leaving Charlene briefly alone in the dark, empty and foggy street. London was closing down for the night. A silent maid hurried by on some last-minute errand, her heels ringing out, and the bread boy was delivering a last order. Apart from those souls, and as she looked up to the dark and cloudy sky, she imagined she could smell snow in the air. She offered the world a small grin. That would be perfect for tomorrow, she thought. Yet she shivered, despite her warm clothing. Lifting a collection of 7 keys from her pocket, she selected the longest, which happened to be made of brass, and stepping up the 7 steps to her freshly painted green front door, she inserted it into the lock. Taking a deep breath, almost as a preventative for any horror she imagined might be lying in wait for her, she gave it a firm twist. The entranceway and the outer hall were in darkness, but the main hallway was bright and welcoming because of a fire which had been roaring since 6 that morning. Satisfyingly, she heard the crackling of another one issuing from the dining room, and she placed her outer coat, hat, scarf and gloves on a rack, noticing Edwina's were already hanging. She strolled into the living room, where a 3-legged spaniel lay before yet another roaring fire. Upon seeing his mistress, the poor thing rose itself up and made its way over as fast as he could, whereupon Charlene made such a fuss of him it was minutes before she could extract herself enough to tug on a bell pull as she stood before the fire, turning occasionally so that each part of her body received benefit. "Now, calm down, Dash. Yes, it is good to see you. Yes, I do love you as well." She spoke as lovingly as any owner of a pet knows how to love an animal. Dash had been born the last but one into a litter of 15 spaniels. His sister, the last and following on from him moments later, was delivered dead, and because of his deformity, the lack of a fourth leg, he was immediately earmarked for destruction at the earliest possible time by his owner, a local silversmith. A responsibility which was handed to his only son, Michael, a precocious 17-year-old already possessed with a penchant for killing. However, kindness was to raise its ancient head that day in the form of a pretty and raven-haired young woman called May, a young woman of which Michael was extremely fond. Let me be plain. His dubious ability to extinguish life was not matched by any degree for his thirst for May, and within an eye-fluttering, hair-tossing moment, the pup was hers. Young May loved the puppy, which she christened Dash in respect for Queen Victoria's own hound. Tragically, God called the beautiful May back to heaven 8 months later by way of a high fever. Her mother and father, a seamstress and oiler, respectfully, too distressed to care and too poor to keep the dog, was about to order his destruction once again when the matter came to the attention of Charlene by way of a delivery boy, whereupon she immediately took the situation into hand and had a maid carry the spaniel home, offering the distressed couple £50 for their inconvenience. Thus Dash slept with his mistress, walked with his mistress, and unconditionally loved his mistress. He could do everything that a 4-footed dog could do except run fast. He could certainly eat as much, a fact that did not go unnoticed by Mrs. White, the cook. However, as he had reached the ripe old age of 10, his once acute healing was failing. But that mattered not a ha'porth to Charlene, who loved her 3-legged friend almost as much as life itself. Sometimes, being with the dog made existing in her parents' house bearable. Within moments of being summoned by the bell cord, a gentle knock sounded, and Miss Holly Pipkin, her housekeeper, a dazzling, handsome and tall woman in her early middle years, and who sported a crown of Irish red hair, entered. She grasped a beautiful ornate silver tray on which rested a single small tumbler of ginger wine. Charlene's attention automatically left Dash and settled on her. "Ah, Miss Pipkin, good evening to you. Good evening." "Good evening, ma'am. Nasty evening. Perhaps there's snow in the air." "Perhaps, Miss Pipkin, perhaps. I see your point, of course. For some wretched souls it must be indeed nasty." "Indeed, madam, it must." Charlene grasped her pre-dinner drink, crossed over to the 2 green leather chairs close to the blazing fire, lowered herself and brought the glass to her lips. As the liquid gently and deliciously burned her throat, Miss Pipkin smiled. "That will warm you, madam. It's so awfully cold out there." "Indeed. And what has Mrs. White prepared for me tonight, pray?" "Roast mutton, madam, all fresh." "I'm sure it is, Miss Pipkin. Cook always senses my needs." "She does her best, madam." "Under your management, Miss Pipkin. I'm sure it is due to your perception." Miss Pipkin smoothed her white apron with more than a sense of pride, and she smiled, rather captivatingly, a pretty smile she knew would please her mistress. "Thank you, madam. Would you like another, for the fog?" "Indeed, no, Miss Pipkin. 1 glass is an adequate amount for dinner." I shall attend to myself and change after my old bones have warmed. Have I time? Yes, madam. I'll call dinner in 1/2 of the hour. Thank you, Miss Pipkin. Now, how has Dash been today? As if he knew he were being talked about, the creature immediately jumped into his mistress's lap and trampled around 3 times before lying down and looking at Charlene's face with the expectant hope that any news given about his performance that day would please. As good as gold, ma'am. Not a peep. He's been waiting for you all day. Mind you, Spicy, the next door's cat, would not have the same opinion, I would guess. Not after he scared the fur off her for being in his territory. Charlene hugged Dash affectionately and pulled gently at his ears between her fingers and thumbs. Well, cats will stray into areas where they are not wanted. I'll walk him after dinner. Why can't people be more like Dash, Miss Pipkin? Oh, indeed, madam, why not? Now take my sister Lucy. About now is the exact time for us to retreat from this everyday conversation. Let us leave them to put the world to right. It was certainly one of Miss Pipkin's small pleasures, and Charlene did not mind occupying her mind with a little gossip occasionally. When they did touch on a subject dear to their hearts, it was easily as if the divide between mistress and servant evaporated. That was the pleasure of having an employer of Miss Charlene's nature. Miss Pipkin had arrived at the Kent's house from Ireland as a young and far thinner girl with a single bright ponytail. She had left her mother and country for no greater reason than of making her way in the world. With the assistance of a distant cousin, she had quickly gained employment in the Kent household, and had risen from the lowest form of help, the scullery maid, to kitchen maid, and thenceforth upwards, as the family became smaller, until she had reached the present position of housekeeper, which she had held for just over 5 years. And when she had chatted, sometimes she stood, sometimes she sat, and sometimes she simply leant against the doorway, giving the impression that she was just about to leave. Her position often had much to do with what was being spoken about at the time. However, tonight's chat about their new neighbours and their cowardly cat was not to last all that long, for Miss Pipkin's many urgent dinner duties forbade her to dally. After she had walked back to the basement, her long black dress sweeping what little dust there was out of her way, her tiny black lace-up leather boots tapping away to nothing, Charlene was soon away to her suite of rooms, leaving Dash, who spent 2 minutes licking the remains of the ginger wine from her glass. The sisters' house was jointly owned, having been left to them when their mother passed away some 16 years previously. Because neither had married, and neither looked as if they were going to tie any matrimonial knot, they continued to live there, seeing no reason to move. Each who had an occasion to know them, friends, neighbours, and distant relatives, thought this most strange, for reasons that will become clear. However, it was an arrangement that suited them both financially. Moreover, when it came to fundamentals, fiscal measures rose above and over emotional concerns. Their house was an interesting and enduring experience for those that visited, for it extruded a mixture of heat and frostiness. The heat I shall explain now. The explanation for the chilliness will come soon enough. Both ladies were accustomed to hearty fires being maintained throughout, especially in the long winter months. As the house, newly decorated 2 summers ago from top to bottom in the temperament of green, was in sparkling and virtual pristine condition, maintained of course by the resolute Miss Pipkin and her underling, the young and impressionable Mary, it radiated an aura of uninterruptible sensibleness. Their residence was, in structure only, identical to 6 others in Woods Place that had been built over a 9-month period in 1740 by Mr. Robert Bobsworth, a rising land dealer, yet a businessman unfortunately loaded with a clandestine reputation for allowing substandard work. Nevertheless, despite Mr. Bobsworth's normally below par business practice and what we would now call creative sense of construction, all 7 buildings turned became a showcase of his finest work, the finished small cluster of dwellings even earning a mention in the building periodicals of the time. Number 7, the last to be built, consisted of 5 floors, which included the spread-in basement where the 4 servants worked, ate and slept, and an attic which was filled to the rafters with the most remarkable souvenirs from the lifetimes of Edwina and Charlene, plus their parents, who had purchased the property in 1810. What was not readily apparent to the outside was the sisters were twins, for it has to be mentioned, Charlene, having made the decision to exercise more, looked on average some 10 years younger than Edwina. Edwina's mottled hair did not help her look as youthful as her sister either. Their birth had taken place on the 2nd floor, and apart from periods away at finishing school, and after when they had briefly followed their father's example and travelled abroad for further education, had lived there all their lives. Their childhood had been comfortable and uneventful, their one single fundamental disappointment being, because Mr. Kent Sr. had often been away at sea, they had matured and hardly recognised him on the rare occasions he did return home to his wife and children. Nevertheless, when he did, there were gifts galore from lands as far away as Africa and China and even the New World. Therefore, over the years, the girls' bedrooms became filled with gifts of all descriptions, many of which were later dispatched to the attic. However, amongst these occasional bursts of contentment, a large and tragic family secret existed, one not even known to Miss Pipkin. Of course, before, when I mentioned friends, neighbours and visitors in general, I really meant visitor. A visitor for Charlene, or a visitor for Edwina, and never the twain met. Henceforth, I begin the explanation of the frostiness that was such a powerful antidote for those stoking great fires. Thus, for better or worse, the guest, or caller, whomever they were visiting, were subject to equal portions of warmth and coldness. Warmth, apart from the fires, for the essence of human kindness itself flowed through the house with remarkable vigour, because of the sisters' constant good deeds, and iciness, because of the tragedy that was locked within the house's walls. A situation that no manner of decoration could disguise, no smile sweep away, and only one person could put right. Because the house faced northwest, the sisters' beautiful back garden captured the sun and became a natural hot spot in the summer. Despite that attraction, it was not used at all by its owners, but was maintained nonetheless to the highest standards by a grey-bearded man, Cook's husband, Mr. White, an ambiguous, pot-bellied fellow, but certainly someone who could tell a busy Lizzie from a geranium. The reason the beautiful five-sided garden was not enjoyed was part of the tragedy of number 7. For although Charlene and Edwina remembered themselves as twin, originally they had been triplets. Another raven-haired and an exceptionally more beautiful young child named Constance, so named after an Irish aunt, was born between the firstborn Edwina and the last, Charlene. It was she who used to sit beneath the apple and pear trees with her pale red parasol, entertaining her admirers, under the watchful eyes of her parents, of course. Why nature provided her parents with 2 plain girls, and one who, as she grew older, became so beautiful that the breath of men were taken away, nobody could explain. Nonetheless, while this difference made no difference when the 3 were children, as they matured into young women, Edwina and Charlene began to notice how much more attention she received, particularly from admirers. While Charlene and Edwina were learning to deal with the necessities of life, and equally and in turn acted foolish and blind towards the masculine sex, it was their middling sister who bewitched London's young men, to the extent that her sisters hardly felt as if they had a sister of the same age at all, for she appeared so terribly more sophisticated compared to their own stammering and clumsiness. Nevertheless, they loved Constance as dearly as they did everybody else. She grew into a stunningly beautiful young woman, whom her mother had often remarked had reminded her of the qualities of the 3 graces or charities, Aglacia, Thalia, and Euphrosyne, beauty, charm, and grace gathered in one body. Gentlemen arrived from all over London and the home counties simply to be within speaking distance of her, if only for an hour or 2. Indeed, she was thought to be a wonderful prize for any man brave enough and rich enough to court. We will leave her now, our imaginations to an extent satisfied. However, we shall return. Thus, the household consisted of 4 live-in servants: Miss Pipkin, the sisters' solitary housekeeper, Mr. and Mrs. White, their gardener and cook respectively, and Miss Mary Brown, the housemaid. All but Mary had been in the sisters' employ for over a decade, so the indifference the sisters had for each other was not at all unusual to them. Moreover, in time, was not at all strange to any one of their visitors either. Important callers, such as the parish vicar, were required to call twice, an inconvenience about which he often complained, but always out of earshot of the lady upon whose charity he was dependent. Nevertheless, that was it. A visit for Charlene and a visit for Edwina. No person questioned the arrangement, it being a simple fact, even though the actual procedure was a temperamental and sometimes logistical problem. Exactly 1/2 of the hour after Miss Pipkin had served the ginger wine to Charlene, she smoothed down her apron, gently kicked Mr. White's expansive feet from under his feet, and nodded to cook before strolling purposely up and then into the dining room, where she, assisted by Mary, served dinner. Edwina, the effect of the brandy now wearing off, had been the first to appear. She had become reasonably inactive when she had reached home. She had changed, of course, brushed and rearranged her hair, poured herself a sherry from the drinks cabinet in her personal suite of rooms, settled into the minutes of a pamphlet, The Hope of Salvation, and waited to be called for dinner. Even though she owned her own company and she gave extensively to charities, she was not renowned for her extensive wage packets, not even for herself, and therefore it was good fortune she had no mortgage. She had given no thought as to what would happen to her business when she might not be able to continue work, but she was of the opinion that that situation would never arise. In the meantime, she was satisfied to maintain her meagre salary, and contrary to her normal benign nature, expected those in her employ to have a parsimonious nature as well. Being vigilant with her purse, she had managed to go through the day, as she normally did, on a small steak and kidney pie, brought locally, and despite her temptation of the costermongers' stalls, she was certain, as she normally was, more than ready for her main meal of the day. Therefore Edwina was already supping thick onion soup when Charlene silently entered the pleasant but darkly decorated dining room, a room full of furniture, unchanged since their parents had died. Now, to any visitor's eyes, had one or any been present, a remarkable event now took place. Or alternatively, it should be reported that no event at all took place, and that was the remarkable event. Because it was, from Edwina's perspective, as if no one had stepped into the room, had walked to the table, had drawn the chair, and arranged a napkin, broke bread, uncovered the soup, picked up a spoon, and started to consume it. It was not as if Edwina were reading or otherwise preoccupied, for she was not. Her mind was, in fact, on nothing. The last sentences and words of the minutes of her journal fading as words do at the end of a long day. Her eyes simply stared ahead while she dreamily supped the strong brown soup. It cannot be stressed enough the extraordinary level of disinterest shown for each other's being, welfare, or even existence. It was as if two souls existed in the same room, yet existed eons apart, simultaneously were occupying the same space, yet lived at opposite ends of the earth. There was no acknowledgement of annoyance, no taut ambience of a past disagreement, no untrustworthy look to see what the other's eyes were doing, as if in recognition to a former difference of opinion. There existed in that room, essentially, one person only, and each sister was that person. So great was this unnatural manifestation of social behaviour that again, had a visitor been present, they may well have been cast into discombobulation. It was a continuing mystery to Mrs. White, the cook, why the two sisters bothered to eat in the same room at all, considering how they treated, or did not treat, each other. However, Mrs. Pipkin, sitting comfortably at the apex of the small pyramid of servants, never became involved in conversations of that nature. At least, not with her staff. She fully understood what it was like to have hard words with a sibling, and even though her squabbles with her younger sister Lucy, who had followed her in her footsteps to London, were short, they were sometimes painful enough. It was easier for her to envisage Christmas being cancelled rather than experience the heartache a long-term separation from her only sister would bring. Therefore, on the beginning of the last evening of the year before Christmas Day, all appeared to be well in the household. Order, such as it was paramount. Dinner was served at the correct time, and it was most filling to those consuming it. Nothing appeared to be different from any other night of the year. At first. Nevertheless, after the mutton had been served, the room's 4 large oil lamps, which always rested to the side of the main table on an early Victorian sideboard, for some mysterious and unfathomable reason, flared up so brilliantly that after some hasty experimenting and being unable to douse the brightness and return them to normality, Miss Pipkin professionally decided that only one was needed, the others being removed. This solitary flame was then transferred from its normal spot to a small table of equal distance between the two women, who had overtly but discreetly ignored the phenomenon in case the situation took a development whereupon they might have recourse to firstly acknowledge each other, or worse, having to communicate. This, without having recourse to the proper, preferred and normal means, namely their solicitors, would have been unthinkable. Nevertheless, while Miss Pipkin and Mary served dinner and wine in the usual circumstances, eventually it was the abnormal lighting conditions that made each sister glance, however hesitantly, at each other. Miss Pipkin noticed Charlene first. It was a sudden peak, so abrupt and swift that an uninformed spectator might not have noticed anything. But then, curiosity overcoming her and taking advantage of the new brightness, Edwina too glanced across to her sister's position before looking hesitantly away. Apart from those epoch-making moments, which as far as Miss Pipkin was concerned outshone anything that those oil lamps were capable, nothing especially different happened as they ate, except during the serving of the pudding, for as the door opened and Mary wheeled in the sweet trolley, the distant loud wailing of a baby could be heard from outside in the short, dark street. Each sister in turn unknowingly stuttered over her meal for the merest hint of a second before resuming as if nothing had been heard. However, each were having different, yet at the same time all-consuming thoughts. Charlene, pleased that she had completed a good day's work, and that her eyes and bones were not as tired as they ought to have been when poring over ledgers, had already decided to retire to the living room and finish off a favourite book, A Christmas Carol, before turning in for an early night. Edwina, though, probably because the alcohol had sent her mind into a brooding darkness, sprawled at the table, supping more wine, after Charlene had wordlessly finished her meal. In a short while there was another gentle double knock that both women ignored, and the door swung open to reveal Miss Pipkin and Mary, who had come to clear the table. Having done a double circuit of the room again, they left silently. The two sisters were not gigantic eaters, having been well trained by their nanny, so after soup, the mutton, and a steamed dumpling pudding, accompanied by 3 glasses of Bordeaux in Edwina's case, and water for Charlene, the more sober one patted down the corners of her mouth with a napkin, and silently vacated the room. No relief appeared on the face of Edwina, no acknowledgement that she was now alone. Had you been in that room, in a position to study her, you would have noticed no change in either her countenance or actions. However, after a few minutes, Edwina stood, supped the last of her wine, and wobbled absent-mindedly to the bay windows near the family Bible on its lectern, which fronted the house, and inspected the street, or at least that part that was visible, which was not very much, for the fog was on the increase again. If that be possible, she thought. Eventually, coming to her senses and snapping herself out of her reverie, Edwina, seeing nothing of note, left the room as silently as her sister had previously. Upstairs, she checked the time and changed her outfit, with the intention of spending the evening playing whist with 4 nursing friends. They only ever played for £1 a trick, but it was never about the wager. Before she left the room, though, she again heard the plaintive and desperate wail of a baby coming from outside. However, although she again placed her face up against the 3 windows in turn, so close that her breath steamed up against the glass, she saw no one accountable. On her way out, she disturbed the staff during their own late supper, and suggested to Miss Pipkin that she need not wait up, for the housekeeper was glad, and thanked her for that courtesy. Having also inquired after Cook's injured arm, an ancient wound, but still one that left her tender in the winter months, and having to wait 2 minutes for a cab, she also found time to leave a few more instructions for Christmas Day's duties, and adjust 2 of the 3 clocks in the downstairs hall. However, she did not enter the living room where Charlene now sat, with Dash curled up by her feet, his brown eyes forever flicking back and forth, tracing each sound. Finally, Edwina took to the swirling dark fog, where a boy, one of 3 Miss Pipkin kept on call, managed to fetch a cab. Coughing slightly as the dusty air played against the back of her throat, she sat back, threw her scarf across her mouth, and stared silently into the gloom, as if it were not Christmas Eve at all. The situation for the servants concerning their employment were complicated over the holiday period. Although their duties to God were paramount, for they were expected to attend church twice a day, next in importance were administering to the needs of the household. On Christmas Day itself, Mary would be allowed to leave at 3 in the afternoon, departing for her parents' small house in Southwark, who were certainly expecting her. but Miss Pipkin and Mrs. White would be on duty all day and evening. Mr. White would assist to a degree, but both women knew that he would only get in their way. By early afternoon, after his lunch, he would be napping by the range in the kitchen. Some 7 days before, Miss Pipkin had taken half a day off, and she had used that time to complete her personal Christmas shopping. A lively spinster, she was young enough to still bear children, yet old enough to recognise the folly in doing so given the position she had attained. Having been in service since she was 13, she was reasonably content with her lot, and had no time for romance except in the halfpenny stories that she occasionally read. The housekeeper was a strong-willed woman, not easily swayed by the opinions of her peers. It was this attitude which enabled her to be at peace with her spinsterhood, being thoroughly immune to what others said and thought about her. She maintained an aura of tranquillity, much desired in a housekeeper, although it was impossible to tell whether that was from intelligence or experience. Once a person grew to her personality, 9 out of 10 thought it was the latter, for she did not carry the expression of a woman of high intellect. She performed her varied duties perfectly, as a woman might, whose wages had risen to the giddy heights of £32 a year, and in truth the entire household would have fallen apart had she left for other employment. For few women would have been able to keep a calm and sensible nature against the intolerable situation which existed between the Kent sisters and remain rational. On her shopping day, the 17th of December, Edwina had been at work, of course, and she had left at her usual time, marking the minutes before she had walked into the cold world. That day Charlene had enjoyed some time at the British Museum, and therefore by 10 o'clock, with both mistresses out from under her feet, and Dash fed, watered, and exercised, Miss Pipkin had performed 3 or more essential chores, instructed Mary on her duties for the rest of the time she was to be away, and that left her on her own time by noon. Shortly thereafter, she was to be found sitting opposite her sister Lucy in Markham's, a congested coffee house in High Holborn, wearing her second-best outfit, a lemon-green fan-front bodice with capped, close-fitting long sleeves and a cartridge-pleated 3-flounced skirt. Her bonnet was gay for the occasion, but she felt the spirit of Christmas upon her, and therefore did not care in the least. Due to low pressure, a breeze had blown in from the west and was accompanied by a brief, fine spell of sunshine, whereupon during the day, travelling through London's busy and noisy streets was made a little more acceptable than the week before, which had been exceptionally weak and dismal. At least she was able to walk without the hem of her skirt becoming soaked. However, having a stoic Irish nature, it mattered not to her what the weather was. She could have been in the eye of a true tropical paradise, because it did not matter, because the local weather always came in for a clobbering, whether it was foul or fair. It was simply conversation. "Oh, Lucy, I do not care for this cold, my dear," she bemoaned, as a tray of tea was brought to their table, while she plucked off her white finger gloves. "How will I endure it?" "Mr. Biffin says it's going to snow," replied Lucy. Her sister enjoyed a thin and pale face that hardly ever smiled, and was a few years younger than Holly. "Oh, how can he know? Your Mr. Biffin is a buffoon. He's a clever enough butler, Holly. He seems to know lots of things the rest of us don't know. Clever or not, I don't think he would last long in my household." "I think that's true. I don't know how you manage it." "By saying nothing at the right time. It is my experience that if I don't ask questions, I get told no lies. But why do they continue to be so dismissive of each other? Only the Lord has that answer, Lucy. Her sister, attentively and having femininely tipped a correct measured level teaspoonful of sugar into her coffee, and with that operation glanced up from contemplating her sister's answer. Whereupon a genuinely broad smile across Lucy's domesticated face, and without a trace of inhibition waved gaily and insolently at an approaching friend, a tall and overweight woman who was wheedling her way through the maze of tables, her skirts getting the better of many customers. "Oh, Holly, as my friend, Miss MacDonald, would you mind if she joined us?" "Of course not, my dear. Welcome her across." Miss Pipkin was, if nothing else, renowned for her sociability. Many of the seated gentlemen present, most of whom were thinner than the approaching large woman, very much resented the prodding of their shoulders and the tapping on the backs of their chairs with her tightly rolled-up umbrella as she issued stiff and loud instructions on how to move themselves. Both sisters smiled indiscreetly as she grew ever closer. Eventually, though, and with much puffing and panting, Lucy and she shook hands, one firmly and one delicately, before she introduced her latest friend to her older sister. Miss MacDonald had a stern laugh as infectious as measles, and quite as loud as a ship's foghorn. Once the formal introductions were over, she seemed to chortle almost 3 times a minute, and when she was not, her smile beamed radiantly, showing the coffee house what an exceptional set of white teeth she had. Lucy had met her at an art class a little less than a month ago, and they had become fast friends, although what bond she knew not. It certainly was not drawing, because no matter how she tried, Miss MacDonald could not hold a line or curve in her head. That day she was involved in exactly the same activity as the Pitkin sisters, Christmas shopping. And like the sisters, the cold had driven her in search of coffee and shelter. Unlike many women of the day, she was over 6 foot tall and positively dwarfed the other two when they eventually stood. It was no secret that she had gained her present position precisely because of her height and girth, for her employers mistakenly thought that she might put the fear of God into those over whom she had authority. "Miss MacDonald is a governess, Holly." "Oh, how interesting. Your charges must be an endless source of joy for you." "One would think so, Miss Pitkin, but I must confess the children place a considerable stress on me. Boys, you see, evil boys, and of the most obnoxious kind. Add a father who is away for days on end, and a mother who takes to the drink." She had lowered her voice to what she thought was an exceptional whisper, but the truth was she could still be overheard from several tables away. "And my position is often most disagreeable." "Disagreeable?" interjected Lucy strongly. "You ought to have my sister's position." "Really? May I ask what it is you do, Miss Pipkin?" "Nothing of great importance. I am in charge of a household." "That should not be troublesome. Do many live in the house, may one ask?" "Just 2 sisters only." "Lucy, you are teasing me," Miss MacDonald exclaimed in a voice of one whom evolution would have taught never to tease. "Ah, but it is the nature of the 2 sisters, is it not, Holly?" "Lucy, I really think this is not a suitable conversation." "Miss Pitkin, my curiosity is aroused. Might you not say a little about your work? Are they evil and wicked people? Do they beat you? Are there boys involved?" Oh, no, no, no. Quite the opposite. They are quiet and gentle ladies. Elderly. They rarely talk. They don't talk? That is it? Yes, Lucy interrupted once more. But it is the manner of their quietness. Can you explain the situation further, Miss Pipkin? The housekeeper drew on her good-natured smile she reserved for such occasions, for she had been called upon so many times to offer an explanation. Nevertheless, she lowered her voice. I mention this in complete confidence, of course. Of course, spluttered Miss MacDonald, her eagerness for gossip overcoming for the moment her respectability. I work for two sisters, and both are extremely kind in their own way. Indeed, they are known for their charitable and philanthropic nature. But they do not talk. That is the essence of them, is it not? Enthused Lucy. Tell Miss MacDonald. Miss Pipkin made a seasonal expression of resignation. That is true. They do not. At least to each other. I beg your pardon? Nothing? Precisely that, Miss MacDonald. Nothing. Not a stitch. And probably never will. They do not converse about the time of day, or about the events of the week. Indeed, they do not rely on each other for anything, and this has continued for as long as I can infer, close on 50 years. There was a brief and astonished silence at the table, while the clatter of coffee cups and soft voices sounded around them. 50 years? You say they have not uttered a word to each other for 50 years? Not a dot? Not a sentence? Indeed, they have not spoken to each other for perhaps all their adult lives. But how do they manage? They come to an agreement over common matters by means of their legal representation. It has always been so. But they live in the same house. Yes, and take their meals in the same room. And while one would think that may cause complications, the situation is so well known and understood by their visitors, none think ill of it any more. But how can any soul exist in a manner whereby one person does not talk to another? One gets used to it. So, this is an immense secret. What happened? What caused them to fall out so? Alas, Miss MacDonald, in all the time I have been in their employ, I have never established the origin. I dare not ask, for it is none of my business, and they have no need to tell me, for it is none of my business. The situation is as it is. I serve both mistresses, yet most times it seems so much as only one exists. How unusual. My sister has a good heart to put up with such a situation. Lucy, one can get used to any situation, and it is a respectable household. Each one treats me well, and the financial arrangements are more than satisfactory. I have a durable roof over my head. I am warm and well fed, which is more than many poor souls will have to endure this Christmas. Yes, that is true, agreed Miss MacDonald. But how peculiar. Now she was neither laughing nor smiling. Yes, it is that. As usual in genteel conversation, after an unsolvable situation manifests itself, following a short time, a conversation would normally drift on to other mundane subjects, and today was no exception. Miss Pipkin's employment position was rapidly forgotten, as the women began to explore other feminine matters. Miss Pipkin, after experiencing 15 minutes of Lucy's new friend, decided that she liked her sufficiently enough to invite her to accompany them on their shopping trip. Therefore Miss MacDonald, finding her smiles and giggle again, was delighted to accept her offer. Once the bill had been paid, with the weather as miserable, the 3 elegantly dressed servants stepped onto the pavement in High Holborn, turned west, and headed for the cluster of shops north of Green Park. However, as if to balance out the extraordinary behaviour of the wealthy Kent sisters, I now relate, almost as an antidote to the foolishness of those close to poverty, one of equal silliness regarding those whose wages were far lower. You have yet to learn why the sisters fell out so long ago, I admit, but when I do get round to relating it, it will be up to you to decide which class was more foolish. The truth will be obvious, I hope, but nevertheless the following incident may demonstrate how sibling rivalry can strike at its worst or at its most feeble. Miss Pipkin, Lucy, and Miss MacDonald, despite the increasingly appalling weather conditions, had spent the afternoon happily shopping for over 2 hours, until Miss Pipkin spied a bonnet in a milliner's shop which she immediately knew would be simply exquisite for a friend's wedding, which was to take place in early February of the new year. The word happy then drifted into oblivion. Unhappily discussing it with Lucy, for it was an item she herself wished to purchase, Miss Pipkin had admired the design. She had smoothed the hand-stitched French lace between her fingers, and then argued with Lucy, who also desired it, but who had finally given way. Finally, the price. Decided that it was well beyond budget, Miss Pipkin made the decision there and then to return when she was not so weighed down with other parcels and packets. Assured by a shop assistant that they had more than a few in stock, and ignoring Lucy altogether by this time, as harsh words had been exchanged, Miss Pipkin felt the discovery of the bonnet rounded off the day most pleasantly, and looked forward to purchasing it a few days before Christmas as a present for herself. However, Lucy, a less sensitive woman, had underestimated the passion with which her older sister had had for that particular article, and when she, 2 days after, had dropped off her Christmas cards at No. 7 Woods Place, fragrantly wearing it, Miss Pipkin was at first annoyed and then incensed that her sister could act so selfish as to claim the bonnet for herself. Foreign and unfeminine words were uttered in the privacy of the underground back passage, listened to by the straining ears of Mr. and Mrs. White and Mary. Unsupported, Lucy departed mid-afternoon, crying miserably into her handkerchief, her card still undelivered, and Miss Pipkin astonished that her own sister could act in such an underhanded fashion. At 7 minutes past 10 o'clock, Edwina returned home, having won not a shilling. Therefore her mood was not even. Indeed, snappy would be a better description. On account of the numerous warm toddies of gin consumed, her eyes had begun to close despite the freezing wet fog, which, although clearing due to a slight breeze, still clung against her like a tight-fitting coat as she sat in her carriage. The horse's hooves slithered and clattered on the freezing wet stones when she arrived home, and when the cab had stopped tipping back and forth, she climbed down and offered the driver a reasonable tip that was gratefully received, after which she stumbled up the stairs to her front door. She did not immediately see what the object to the lower right of her was until she was upon it, and only then because she had touched it lightly with her boot. Gazing down at the obstruction through a semi-drunk haze, she first thought it was a dog, until she realized that dogs do not come as squarely or as yellow as this object appeared to be. Gradually, though, the washed-out, thick, oily air she recognized as a wicker basket. Without giving it a moment's thought, it was scooped upon and gathered up, but was surprised by its weight. Upon a closer examination, her other hand steadying her bonnet, which was desperately trying to cover her eyes, she perceived the red and white pattern of gingham cloth neatly tucked down on all sides. Then came her greatest surprise, for whatever was underneath the material made a noise reminiscent, for those whose lives have been spent in the country, like a tiny sheep coughing. Pushing her head drunkenly out from her shoulders, she darted a look down into the street, wondering if anybody was watching her. However, there was only the soundless, ever-swirling fog, the occasional lonely and distant foghorn floating in from the direction of the Thames, the endless soft chatter of London, and herself. Once again she heard the noise, more like a tiny gurgle this time, and curiosity forced her to pull on the cloth until she saw, by the weak gaslight, the sweetest little infant she had ever seen. He or she, for Edwina did not know which at the time, gazed up with inquiring eyes, already accustomed to the night, and upon recognizing the angular face as a friend, smiled and gurgled even louder. The perfect response for 1,000,000 parents. Edwina's reaction was unusually quick, given how much she had had to drink. For a speed unaccustomed to drunken women in general, let alone those with little inclination to it, she whisked out her bunch of keys, opened the door, raised the basket to the level of her waist, and hurried in before any of her neighbours, all of which she imagined were watching, could take notice of her. Then, once in the hall and peering again at the child, having saved it from the cold, she was rather struck with how next to proceed. There was only one thing to do, of course. Only one person to visit in such a crisis. Miss Pipkin's 2 rooms were only 1 flight of stairs down, and so it was within a minute she was tapping on her door. "Miss Pipkin! Miss Pipkin! Come quickly, come quickly!" She whispered loudly, unaware that by repeating herself it would make her housekeeper answer no less quickly, because behind the door the servant was all of a flutter. Only the house itself burning to the ground would warrant one of the mistresses calling on her that time of night, surely. In the hallway there was a short pause, accompanied by a shuffling beyond the other side of the door, but then it opened and the housekeeper stood before her, clutching her white voluminous nightgown tightly around her bosom, her face charged with questions, and her red hair, now loose, flowing around her shoulders. Yes, her red hair, let loose from its normal imprisonment, now fell and resembled a cascade of dark golden water, which glinted by Edwina's candle, which, like its superior cousins earlier that evening, was glowing unnaturally bright, almost roaring. The effect so surprised Miss Pipkin and Edwina that she took a single step backward, for she had never before seen her so informally attired. "Miss Kent," she spoke softly but intently, "is there an emergency?
It is so late, madam. Miss Pipkin, I have a baby here. I have found a baby on our doorstep, and I thought your position would be better for the dealing with it. A baby? Miss Pipkin echoed in a manner no different had she discovered Queen Victoria and Prince Albert themselves sitting in the mistress's front room. A baby, Miss Pipkin, a baby. Look for yourself. The basket containing the infant was duly thrust out for her inspection. Oh, my word, it's a baby. Indeed, Miss Pipkin, indeed. Will you take it from me, please? Me, madam? I don't know how to care for an infant. Miss Pipkin, you come from a family of many children. I do indeed, madam, but I'm a childless woman. I have had no experience, madam. I have had no experience of these things either, Miss Pipkin, but I could not leave it to perish in the cold and dark on our doorstep, on tonight of all nights. That's all very well, mistress, but... Oh, here is a note. Read on. Miss Pipkin held up the parchment to the light of the flaring candle. It's very badly written, madam. Almost a scrawl. It reads, "My name is Shannon. Please look after me." Well, I never did. A girl. I expect she's hungry. You must feed her, Miss Pipkin. Her housekeeper opened her door a little wider, and what was left of her maternal instincts, that part of her femininity that had not been worn away by time and impatience, came forward. The child's sex now identified. Her warmth to it increased. I could heat a little milk. That's the spirit, Miss Pipkin, and you'll look after it tonight, will you not? All night, madam? But what of tomorrow, my busiest time? I cannot deal with it at the moment, Miss Pipkin. I am to bed. Oh, madam, whose is she? You're a good woman, Miss Pipkin, a good woman. Thank you, madam, but... She stopped talking as the basket was pushed towards her, taking a closer look at the tiny glowing face that had decided to smile once more at this new and slightly more pleasant face and soft voice. Well done, Miss Pipkin. That's the spirit. Edwina enthused before she quickly turned away and took to the stairs. Thank you again, Miss Pipkin. It would all become clear in the morning. That was all the housekeeper heard as she stared at her receding back. A baby! She looked down again at the child, now in her arms. A baby! Who would leave a child on her doorstep? Depositing her hat and gloves in the main hallway stand, Edwina held her candle slightly aloft, again surprised at the amount of glowing light it radiated. But in her inebriated haste to reach her bed, she gave it no further thought. Within a minute, she was in her rooms, where she first stoked the dying embers of her fire before pulling back a curtain, enabling her to look at the empty and poorly lit wet street, fully expecting to see an unmarried mother pacing to and fro, wringing her hands and pushing an empty perambulator. She shook her head again. Well, I never. A baby! One of Mary's winter duties was to make up the fires in each of the main bedrooms and place a hot bedpan in each of her mistress's beds. Normally, Edwina would have retired after 9, and the girl would have been on hand to remove it. But tonight, her absence freeing her from that duty, she took upon it herself to do it. This she did not mind, for it did not occur all that often, and even she thought it was rather unreasonable to get the girl out of bed for such a trivial operation. While still rather light-headed, she turned around from the windows, only to be halted dead in her tracks by an unnatural brightness that threw everything into sharp relief. but only for a second or two before she resumed walking towards her wardrobe, her candle thrust out before her as she normally carried it. She was about to light the lamp by her bedside. However, when she saw that her single candle was performing beyond all natural expectations, and strangely too, for she could see perfectly well into the dark corners, considering the limitations of her eyes. She had not wished to see her room so clearly at first, not wanting to acknowledge it in any way, and she did her best to ignore the difference, for she thought it had something to do with her condition. However, by the time Edwina had undressed and pulled on her nightgown and released and brushed her hair, she sat heavily on the end of her bed and stared at what was troubling her the most. At first she rubbed her eyes with no effect, then looked away, and then suddenly at the candle once more, but again it was the same. Whatever was causing her room to be brightened by the slightly blue ethereal light, it was not the single and extraordinarily glowing candle. Goodness me! However, the moment she dropped into bed and pulled the covers tightly around herself, she knew there was something quite different about that particular night. Edwina had been using that fireplace since she had been a child and knew very well how much warmth it radiated. She was experienced in knowing how long it took for it to drop to a certain coolness, and even how long it would take to warm up the room during the various seasons. Nevertheless, tonight there was a difference once she had acknowledged the presence of it, for the bed was positively roasting. So much so that she soon threw back the covers to check that the sheets were not smouldering. In fact, had the exquisite heat not made her feel so immediately sleepy, she would have left it, feeling that the bed had been spooked. However, once under the covers again, her toes wriggled and rubbed against each other as they celebrated the warmth, for inside the boots of the mistress, nearly all evening her feet had been exposed to a low degree despite the warmth of her friend's house. A baby! She wondered again as tiredness swept over her. What on earth next? Fatigue and alcohol were formidable foes to fight against so late at night, and when combined with the abnormally warm bed, she felt her resistance fail, and snuffing out the candle, she slept utterly soundly for about half an hour. Edwina's swift retreat had left Miss Pitkin with little illumination, but before she could tackle that problem, before re-entering her rooms, she unkindly raised Mary from her sleep to assist her. When they returned, she struck a match to hasten away the gloom, and the effect of this familiar candle-lighting custom caused Mary to cry out loudly, "Lord, Miss Pitkin, what have you there?" For, unlike the others that had been lit that evening, the candles spluttered and burnt with the brightness of 7. "I have no idea, Mary. The oil is bright as well." "What have you done with them?" "I haven't done anything, you impudent girl." "They are positively arcing, Miss Pitkin." "Oh, I don't know. It's a fine light, but I don't know." "Must be the air, Miss Pitkin. The cold air. That's what it is." Miss Pitkin, a quiet, knowing look spreading across her face as she nodded in agreement, lifted up a corner of the gingham cloth, which the little smiling mite inside took as a signal to utter another tiny gurgle. "Miss Pitkin, what on earth?" "Miss Edwina just brought her to me.
Said she found her by the front door. Her name is Shannon. Miss Pitkin, she's wonderful. Now don't you get in all soppy. I brought you in here to help out, seeing as you've got 6 sisters and 2 of them in arms. Who is she? Don't know. Didn't I say that? And as if I hadn't got enough to do. Now heat up some milk, my girl, before she screams the house down. Miss Charlene won't like that for sure, but she must be informed. Miss Pipkin trusted a brandy and water might soften the information she was about to deliver, and a double rap on her door produced her customary "Enter, please," although it was uttered with rather a tremor, for her oil lamps were behaving in much the same manner as all others in the house, and she had given up attempting to understand what was happening. Neither could Dash, for he had left his basket and now lay comfortable and safely curled up between the feet of his mistress as she lay in bed, still reading Mr. Dickens's novel. As her sister's room was previously, it too was glowing with the same celestial light. As you're still up, Miss Charlene, I thought something to keep out the chill, madam. Chill? All right, Miss Pipkin, but my lord, what have you done with the fire? What coal is this? And the candles, and the lamps? Why, everything is charging like a furnace. Oh, madam, I don't know. It's a mystery. It started not so long ago. Well, there seems to be no harm in it, as long as we don't all burn to death in our sleep, eh? Oh, madam, I have to say something important. The other tenant, madam, found a baby girl by our front door, and she gave her to me to look after. She's downstairs. A baby? Downstairs? But it's Christmas Eve, Miss Pipkin. Babies are not found on Christmas Eve. Well, with the deepest respect, madam, there's one downstairs, Miss Charlene, and I thought you should know about it in case you were awoken by her and wondered what the noise was. Charlene, her previously chilled toes now highly reluctant to leave the comfort and warmth of her bed, frowned distinctly, and her eyes stared at her housekeeper over her reading spectacles, but then reached for the brandy. You cut along now, Miss Pipkin. All right. Give me a short while. Edwina had not been cowardly about her almost non-existent maternal duty the next morning, Christmas Day. That is, to inquire about the condition of the child. She simply forgot, that was all. As was her custom, she rose early, and under a deadened dark sky, left Wood's Place by 6 o'clock, heading for Price's coffee house in Leadenhall Street, whereby it was her wont to sit and pursue the dailies before work. She did this with such regularities that only a colossal force would change this habit of a near lifetime. Evidently, the discovery of a free baby on the doorstep late one evening on Christmas Eve did not overcome this demand, nor did the unusual heat of the fires or the brightness of the lamps in her room and landing defer her from her course. She assumed that Mary was using a new batch of oil or candles or coal. That was all. It was not going to be for another 7 hours until she was reminded of the child, by way of an crying infant sounding from the cold street outside her warm offices. Then she had held her pen, frozen in the air, remembering, until one of her clerks had spoken. Glancing at her watch, she saw that it would be almost another 4 hours before she would be able to speak to Miss Pipkin again. Scribbling a note, she summoned the lad and sent the boy off to deliver an emergency telegram. An appointment and dinner with an old friend that evening would have to be postponed. Bless them, bother! Why outhouse? Aren't there hospitals for this sort of thing? She muttered. And that was the full content of Edwina's short, inexplicable dream after she had fallen asleep. her toes roasting as if they were in a fire themselves. When she awoke, covered in perspiration, a glance at her silver sterling watch told her that she had only been asleep for less than 35 minutes. Yet the intense nature of the illusion had seemed like hours. Her room was tremendously hot by now, and she seriously considered opening a window, or at least dampening down the fire which still roared in the hearth, as if an endless supply of coal was being heaped on it. She snapped, "This is preposterous." Lighting a candle had the same effect as lighting a candle anywhere else in the house. It caught and then flared, providing easily, as Mary implied earlier, at least 7 times the brightness as a normal candle ought to do. However, it was when she blew out the taper, replacing it in its holder, and having put on her spectacles, that her eyes widened. For what she saw had the effect of wanting to immediately slip back into the roasting bedclothes. Edwina held her breath and stared momentarily at the presentation that hung before her. For her entire bedroom was decorated from floor to ceiling with Christmas decorations of all shapes, colours, and kinds. There were stars and ribbons, flyers and reflecting baubles, paper chains and festive cutouts of every conceivable hue and shape. So many, in fact, that the strict design of the ceiling became seriously impeded. To all intents and purposes, she might well have awoken in a different room. "It's a baby, Miss Pipkin." Charlene eventually made it to the kitchen, where she sat in a pink, voluminous nightgown in the spare chair next to a spluttering and grustling fire, dabbing her brow and cheeks with a large plain handkerchief, one of 3 she kept on her person. "Your silence is excruciating, Miss Pitkin." "Yes, madam. A girl, madam. She is not mine. Your... Oh, madam, I'm sorry. Your sister left her with me a while ago." "I beg your pardon. I have no sister, Miss Pitkin." "I'm sorry, madam. I meant the other lady who lives in the room above you." "And so what does this have to do with myself?" "She left her with me, and I have never cared for no baby before, madam. That's why I asked Mary to step in. It's not right if it is hers." Charlene nodded slowly at first, and then with a touch of enthusiasm. "Yes, very well then. I see the situation. It is unpardonable that you should carry the burden, Miss Pipkin. However, it should only be for one day, for surely some gentleman will return later and correct the error." "I hope so, Miss Charlene. What else can it be?" Charlene gently pulled back the blanket that covered the baby's mouth. "She's a tiny thing." "Hello," she cooed. "Not to worry, Miss Pitkin. Are you out of pocket?" "I have no idea what babies cost." "Oh, no, madam. Mary has been looking after her very well, and she's only taking milk." Charlene straightened up, lifted herself out of the chair. "Well, it was correct of you to inform me, of course. Please keep me appraised of any developments. Oh, and well done to you as well, Mary." "Thank you, madam." "I will, madam," said Miss Pitkin. "And, madam, the candles and the fires, what is happening to them?" "Now that is a mystery, Miss Pitkin, and one I don't care to solve. My eyes won't be half as sore tomorrow, I'm sure. But having said that, Perhaps it will be best if a new batch of candles and a fresh delivery of coal is ordered.
I can't do that until after tomorrow now, madam. Then we are in for a bright and a hot Christmas day. By the way, Miss Pipkin, well done with the decorations. Charlene nodded enthusiastically. How you managed it, I'll never know. Did not see them earlier. Most strange, that. Madam, if I may, what decorations? Why, the Christmas ones, Miss Pitkin. Well done. First-class effort on all the staff's part. Put up so quickly, too. We haven't put up any decorations, madam. The household just hasn't had the time so far. I had planned to put up a tree tomorrow morning. It's resting out back as we speak. Then, Miss Pitkin, you have fairies working in the house. Come. Charlene walked out of the low-ceilinged kitchen, and Miss Pitkin followed her thin back up the stairs to the ground floor, followed by Mary, now clutching the baby in her arms, until they stood in the front hall, which, like Edwina's room, was resplendent in the glittering colours and shapes of Christmas. Miss Pitkin felt the need to steady herself, and she shook her head. Oh, madam, I or the staff didn't do any of this. But how? Oh, it's a mystery, madam, and I don't like mysteries. Outside Edwina's partly frosted and misty windows, the fog became thicker, and the air she could easily see was freezing cold. Her growing confusion over the baby, the brightness of the candles, the heat of the fire, and now the absurd decorations expressly forbade her to enjoy any of it. In truth, she was not feeling at all festive or sparkling, so whomever or whatever had placed these embellishments had failed utterly in their intention. However, knowing she had a toddy in her room, for emergency and medicinal purposes only, of course, she shuffled across to the little cabinet and took a dose. But then a double rap on her door caused her to twirl around rapidly. Rather irritably and guiltily, it must be said, she replied to her visitor. "Who's there?" she barked, as she pushed her way across the room as if she was walking through treacle. Mary was there, by the order of Miss Pitkin, wringing her thin pink fingers together, pacing back and forth, wearing out the thin pile. By the light of her glowing candle above her head, like her mistress's rooms, green paper decorations of every kind, description, shape and shade were hanging. Oh, madam, it's a miracle, a blooming miracle. Edwina managed to only sound incredulous. Mary, what is happening? Is the household barking mad? What is all this? No, madam, no one knows, but it's all from heaven. Edwina held her nightdress around her and brushed her servant aside, still not fully recovered from the strange timeless dream she had undergone. Fetch Miss Pitkin. I will not have this disturbance here, at this time of night too. Fetch her at once, and ask her to explain what lunacy this is. Mary scampered away, clutching her incandescent globe of light, and while waiting for her housekeeper to arrive, she began to inspect one of the hall lamps, squinting against its radiance. However, becoming too close, she finally had to shield her eyes and inquisitively tapped it gently with a forefinger. It flared even more then, so much so that she felt it wise to stand back when the softly roaring, glowing ball of light did not subside. The frightening part of what she saw
Was it through dark and long shadows across and down the hallway, all of which sent a shiver down Edwina's spine? She returned to the centre of the hallway and began to inspect the decorations by rubbing some of them between her finger and thumb, and giving them a cautious sniff, but then, not being the most patient woman in the world, decided to stroll downstairs to see where the servant girl had got to. Where, in the main hallway, she found a commotion of the most indecent kind, given the time of night. Mary was pleading with Miss Pitkin to come along, almost pulling on her sleeve, but as the baby, now held by the housekeeper and enjoying the close experience, if it be correctly told, of being wrapped in swaddling clothes, was bubbling and crying, it was clear to any level-headed woman that the housekeeper was not going anywhere. Nevertheless, for the first time in decades, Edwina's back stiffened in disapproval, for Charlene was also present, confusingly inspecting the decorations, touching the baby's cheek, and generally, in Edwina's opinion, simply being there. Her first instinct was to feel revulsion at this intruder, as if she had spied a thin, talking maggot that had the audacity to wear a nightgown in her house. However, that emotion fleetingly disappeared, to be solidly replaced with an angry arrogance for this intruder's presence. Edwina's second thought, coming a moment behind the first, was to turn around and retreat. However, because she had come upon the three of them plus baby so rapidly, reversal without losing self-respect was impossible. She therefore had no choice but to face what could not be faced. Therefore her steadfastness rose to the fore and breached the malevolent emotions she felt for the talking maggot. "Miss Pitkin, what is the meaning of this?" "Oh, madam, you have stepped down." "I don't know, madam." "The lamps, Miss Pitkin. What about the lamps? What is to be done?" "I do not know, madam. Every candle and lamp in the house are glowing like the devil's own yellow eyes. There must be a reason." "It's just ours, madam. The Beckham's family next door are normal. I've seen them through their windows." "Or as normal as that family will ever be," interjected Charlene uncharacteristically. This brought a sudden diminutive glance from Edwina, because she was personally fond of Mr. Beckham. It was true they were new money. She was a stunningly beautiful woman, an example of a modern femme du monde, having assembled a fortune by publishing a series of sensational and graphic historical novels, and he, the youngest son of a general, and quite easily the most handsomest man in the district. In public the Beckhams were polite enough, and Mr. Beckham always touched the rim of his hat with his cane while greeting neighbours on the street, the mark of a gentleman at least. Therefore Charlene's reason for her uncharacteristically bitter remark remained unknown, but it did not remain unchallenged. "It's just this house, madam," repeated Miss Pitkin. "That's rot, Miss Pitkin, and would you please ask this person here to keep her opinions to herself?" The housekeeper could not believe the amount of venom with which this sentence was uttered. This unheard-of reference to Charlene, the only other woman present, and she held her breath for 2 long seconds in the empty silence before she spoke again. "It is the truth, madam," Miss Pitkin continued in awe, "as I live and breathe. And what am I to do with your baby, madam?" "She is not mine, Miss Pitkin. How dare you make such an allegation? It is not mine. I discovered it on the porch, as I said. Give it in." "I could not keep her, madam," spoke Mary. "Be quiet now, girl." Miss Pitkin turned on her.
take her and be off with you now. Madam, you did bring it to my attention. The sound of the baby ceased mercifully as she was taken to the basement kitchen again, and there was laid on a box by the spit, after which Mary placed a grill between her and the flaring and yellowing, spluttering fire. You are a bonny girl, yes you are. Your eyes. Every word was true, for the infant's eyes shone expressively like the few bright candles around her. The baby's eyes were like the bottom of a shallow lake, deep blue and perfectly clear, with long dark lashes imitating reeds. As Mary tapped the crib to comfort the child, she could still hear her betters talking above her head. But as her own eyes rolled up to catch the sounds, she too spied many new and wonderful decorations hanging from the wide wooden joists, many of which she would have sworn on the good book were not there only 10 short minutes ago. Although the kitchen was blisteringly hot, she felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. The baby giggled as babies do, and Mary was torn between playing with her and listening to what was happening above. Placing some milk on the end of her little finger, she placed it inside the baby's mouth, and the giggling abruptly stopped. Mary then held her breath and listened with a little more concentration, her attention divided between the harsh words and the ever more beautiful decorations above her, which now seemed to pop into existence in all the places where her eyes never focused. Miss Pipkin, I will pretend I did not hear that. How dare you display such effrontery? I found the child in good faith on my way home, in my own house. It could have happened to any other person who lives in this house. Yes, madam. I'm so sorry, madam. And what has this woman been told? Just the facts, madam. No speculation from me. If I have hurt your feelings, Miss Pitkin, it is because mine are injured as well. I have no idea where this child is from, but I did not, I can assure you, play any part in its origin. Yes, Miss Edwina. As little as I know about her, Miss Pitkin, I very much doubt she has anything to do with its making either. It is obvious, really, some mother wishes to give her infant a better start in life, so she drops it off at the steps of wealthy women, a wealthy woman. It is plain. Oh, madam, you're probably right, but what shall we do? Do? Give her up, Miss Pitkin, and attend to the business of these lights and fires. Arrange for someone to visit and correct them. Dim them. Yes, madam. I'll do that. And madam, the decorations, madam, where have they come from? It was clear, even to an outsider, which of the two sisters had the easier temperament, for while Edwina fumed, Charlene sat, eyes closed, on one of the hard chairs used by waiting visitors, and was so still. She made a difference. However, before Edwina could answer the unanswerable, a single sudden flash of light emanated from the front room, punctuated the darkened hall space, violently illuminating every corner with the force and energy of a lightning bolt. Miss Pitkin took a step backwards in distress, losing her footing, and even Charlene's unflappable self lost her composure, for her eyes opened wide and she uttered a religious expletive, which she certainly was not taught at school. As for Edwina, she loosened the grip she had on her nightdress, and it fluttered open. Whatever caused the unimaginable and powerful explosion of light lit up the hallway as if the roof of the house had been suddenly lifted away from the rafters.
The effect was the same, as if they had been exposed to the full force of a summer's day at midday. A colossal breath of oddly silent hot wind accompanied the visual commotion, and all cowered automatically. However, there was no thunder to accompany the disturbance. In fact, no supernatural noise at all disturbed the peace of the night and of the rapidly approaching Christmas Day. What awaited the sisters and their housekeeper when they summoned the courage to enter the front room caused their mouths to drop impolitely a good inch, and they stood in the doorway like statues, unable to speak, until Charlene eventually broke the silence. Mother of God! Between themselves and the 3-bay window that fronted the house and the wintry foggy night was a Christmas tree of immense height and girth. It sat in a tawny-coloured sand in a suitably large and traditionally coloured pottery urn, itself decorated by a ring of coloured paper chains and cotton wool. The tree's spiky lowered leaves gently touched the polished wooden floor, and, true to the spirit of the occasion, on its apex, which reached the ceiling, was a figurine of a smiling golden cherub which clung on desperately, a silver star grasping in one of its hands. The fragrant pine tree was positively and heavily festooned with baubles, tinsel stars, and shiny red apples and walnuts. Red, white, and blue candles, glitter, chocolate wraps, sweetmeats, and gifts of every possible description hung heavily from its evergreen bough. Long, sparkling ribbons of colour seemed to fly everywhere, defying all gravity. Paper cornucopias hung aplenty, wax angels, metal crosses, and gold paper wings positively swathed in its outer branches, all of which had been cleverly made to look as if there had been a recent snowfall by the ingenious use of sugar and alum powder. Underneath its spreading branches were festooned boxes of all shapes and sizes, wrapped with ribbons and coloured festive paper. In addition, amongst them, as if guarding the presents, were dolls of such realistic workmanship that they looked like tiny, motionless people. The air was suffused with the scent and weight of fine prine and Christmas food, and between these stimulations and the glorious visual feast that stood before them, the two sisters were immediately and instinctively shocked into memories of Christmases long ago. Yes, it sat in its own huge red pot, squarely and securely, a muster in the room, an object defying convention, a tree positively demonstrating, here I am, and it is Christmas, and may no man, woman, or child forget it. Miss Pitkin, still wordless, and behind the sisters, wobbled slightly on her knees before collapsing into a nearby chair, while Edwina was forced to steady herself on her cane. The vision was a double surprise for her, for she could see it properly, and that was astounding. There were no smudged images, no blurring, no distortion, and she, like the others, gazed in wonder at the impossible phenomena. "I can see it clearly," she gasped, lifting her hand to touch her eyelids. "Miss Pitkin, I can see it clearly. I have no pain. I can see everything clearly again. Charlene, I can see..." However, immediately an antiquated embarrassment sense flooded over her as she realized what she had said. To conceal her awkwardness, Edwina recovered in the most English of ways, coughing
ever so politely, uncovering her mouth with the back of her hand before quickly turning to Miss Pitkin, who had become mesmerised by the colours and the effects. "Well done, madam. So on the day after tomorrow, will you take the child in?" However, our housekeeper was not so imprudent. "Oh, madam, the tree, where did it come from?" But however breathtakingly beautiful the Christmas spectacle was, whatever its meaning, it did not touch Charlene, who had fallen into silence during those highly embarrassing moments. As poets know, love will either inspire itself or its opposite, and here and now, the antithesis of Christmas, its blackened, evil competitor, came exploding out in anger and acid, as if galvanized by those sweet memories of former happy Christmases her mind remembered. She turned, therefore, on the housekeeper. "Confound it, woman! Strangers will not speak to me in my own house. Will you please tell this woman that I do not wish to converse with her, and neither do not wish to be conversant with her medical matters?" Edwina recovered enough to viciously reply. "Then, Miss Pitkin, please inform this person that should she wish to communicate with me, then it should be done in the preferred and agreed means by solicitor. And would you tell this woman that I do not welcome trickery in my home, and that she must cease immediately? And please tell this person that I have never had to indulge in any trickery to achieve what I wish for in life. And please tell this woman that it was only a full complement of trickery that caused her life to be diverted from its original course. And now perhaps you might like to inform her that whatever part she played in that long-ago drama, she has not suffered enough for it. Tell this person that father never properly forgave her. Mother would not have died of her broken heart had she not carried out—" Miss Pitkin stood suddenly, almost with a jump, and surprised them both by silently holding up her hands in agitation, accompanied by a desperate shaking of her head. An observer, who was not aware of her normally sound manner, might have imagined that the Almighty had made an unexpected visitation. However, the truth was, years of silence found a voice. "Ladies, I am so sorry, but I must now be dreaming. Either that or I'm losing my mind. A child has appeared to us on Christmas Eve. Our lamps are dazzling. Our fires are too warm. Festivities are miraculously and magically appearing, and now your house is blessed with the glorious symbol of peace and forgiveness. Can you not make your peace, madams, or will you take this pretence to your graves? Miss Edwina, madam, I do not have the time to take the child anywhere. May I suggest that you do it yourself if you are that concerned? We have 2 deliveries Christmas morning, and I have work to do this Christmas. If this day is to take on the appearance and normality of any other Christmas, which it certainly looks like it is not going to be, I would put a flutter on it, I am so certain." A kind of silence filled the room, of a shocking kind, as if one had fallen foul of a king or queen. However, it was of a powerful nature, and it shook the angry women back into our dimension, whereupon their humbleness returned. "Mary can take the child, then," volunteered Charlene. "I feel somehow that the baby is connected to this hullabaloo. I cannot say how, but I feel it." "Madam, Mary cannot, for she has work of her own tomorrow, and besides," Miss Pipkin lowered her voice, "she has already become most attached to her madam. It would be cruel to ask her to take the wee thing to the workhouse if she spends any more time with her." "This is preposterous." "Well, when then?" "It is such an awkward time. Perhaps in a day or two, madam, when the good day has passed." Edwina, slower at recovering from the impotent directions suggested to her by her housekeeper, spluttered vaguely, if only to reassert her position as mistress. "Can you not call someone?" "Oh, madam, who knows who may come? We're mentioning a wee baby. I should satisfy myself that she would be looked after by the proper authorities." "If you must. No. Very honourable, Miss Pipkin. Very honourable. I understand. It costs us nothing, and it is Christmas, I suppose." A token, dart-like nod of acknowledgement from Charlene brought a sudden and welcome response from the housekeeper. "Oh, thank you, Miss Edwina. Thank you, Miss Charlene. You won't hear from her at all. I'll make sure of it." "A baby here for Christmas. Well, I never did, and no mistake. It's as queer as anything else." Edwina touched her chin, quite mystified. "I'm back to my bed, Miss Pipkin," spoke Charlene, turning away. "Such nonsense and tripe. Good evening to you." Edwina, quite unlike how she had acted during the thousands of meals they had consumed in the same room together, now glanced dolefully at her sister's receding back, but said nothing. Miss Pipkin noticed her look, and relief flashed across her face, for perhaps she thought this was the beginning of the end of their gigantic feud. Moreover, if that were the case, it would make her life a great deal easier. However, hovering in the back of her mind, as Edwina too bade her good night, and left her to her tangled thoughts about the whereabout of the tree and all the other decorations, she knew that it would probably take a miracle to fix whatever was broken between them. Mind you, she mused, as she began to briefly examine the gifts and the pretty things hanging from each bough, perhaps it is time for a miracle.
Almost having to dodge her way through the now dense growth of colourful Christmas decorations which seemed to be, however impossible, popping into existence right before her eyes, or at least wherever she was not looking, Charlene returned to her rooms, where Dash naturally gave her the warmest of welcomes, the spaniel's excitement overwhelming, as if he had not seen his mistress for months instead of minutes. "Hello, boy. I expect you are warm enough with that thick old red coat of yours. Why can't people be like dogs, sir? You'll never let me down, will you, boy?" Despite the lateness of the hour and the appalling frosty conditions outside, the oven-like conditions of the room forced her to ease open one of her windows a little, and then climbing back into bed, immediately fell deeply asleep, the event announced by even and deep breathing, which, when Dash heard, crept up to the forbidden place beside his mistress's body and laid a protective paw on one of Charlene's arms, and then his head on that, while his brown eyes glanced and inspected the room, all the time watching the decorations as they unexpectedly appeared. His mistress's own eyes began to dart back and forth behind her lids, as if intently watching real life. Almost at once, and unusually for her, Charlene began to dream in the most fantastic fashion. Edwina, ignoring the temperature conditions of her own rooms as well, which were in a condition similar to Charlene's, after sipping another small brandy and pacing for a while, she too fell deeply into a long sleep of astonishing dreams. Therefore, with little time to go until the day of grace, peace finally descended upon the house. Mr. and Mrs. White slept throughout every unusual episode, but they would pay for that the next morning with stark, genuine surprise, as they would find their room utterly enclosed with decorations. Outside, the freezing fog slowed as another low swept in from the north, carrying with it the gift that all Christmases needed: snow. Miss Pipkin, after checking on the baby for the umpteenth time and finding Mary more than capable of being a surrogate mother, had finally returned to her rooms, and being unable to sleep because of the epoch-making events which she had witnessed, heard, and taken part in, had risen and attempted to read in her cosy chair by the fireplace, the embers keeping her warm, but then had dropped off to sleep immediately. She would pay for that with a stiff neck in the morning. As the clocks of the house ticked ever forward and passed beyond midnight, the true silence of Christmas Day descended upon the street and all its conditions and souls. All became mystifyingly and spiritually quiet, as the low at last dissipated the fog and allowed first starlight to shower upon London, then the enchantment of a third-quarter silver moon, only in its turn to be eclipsed by the gentle charisma of falling snow in the early hours of the morning, courtesy of clouds which selected in from the west. Mary, the lowly housemaid, dreamed of achieving greater things than what she had so far achieved, for she was so desperate to rise to a higher station. In the makeshift cot next to her bed, in the tiny room at the back of the house near the scullery, the baby girl slept too. But at the same time as the weather outside was making way for how things should traditionally look on an English Christmas Day, her tiny baby body gave the slightest hint of a shudder as her spirit rose out of it silently and surely. Connected to its physical body by a fine, iridescent and silver-coloured thread, her ghostly presence hovered lightly and briefly over its tiny corporeal body, before ascending, all the while growing and enhancing itself with detail, clarity, and brightness. Through walls, floors, and cavities it passed as easily as a baby's cry, the material world a hindrance no more, as it soared to the very top of the house until it reached a large, empty, dark, and unwelcoming room on the 4th floor. This cheerless area was in penetrating contrast to the rooms in the rest of the house, for there was no fire keeping a cheerful watch over it, or even one made up ready to be put ablaze. A telling touch was that there was an obvious absence of the magical flowers and decorations. When Miss Pipkin entered into service and arrived there 2 decades ago, she was given strict instructions by Miss Vaughan, the meticulous housekeeper of the time, never to enter the large bedroom, whose outlook overlooked the back garden. Not only was she never offered an explanation, the young Miss Pipkin had been too much in awe of her to ask. She knew the window well enough from the grounds, though. It was the only one looking so miserable and unpainted, and together with its unwashed, grimy panes of glass, stood in stark contrast to the rest of its clean and shiny neighbours. But Miss Pipkin, despite not being an inquisitive soul, and mostly more than happy to let things be, eventually had worked out that whatever was its secret, it probably had much to do with why her mistresses were engaged on their feud. Nevertheless, she had never discovered a direct connection to prove her suspicions. The soulless room was plainly furnished with worn furniture, but even the witless would have been able to observe that it once was not, for its formula opulence could be felt, despite what the eye could not see. An unadorned large iron bedstead, made up but unused, was centre stage. Several items of early Victorian furniture and a once expensive carpet, all of which were covered with a thick layer of dust, showed how vacant and unloved this room was. Mirrors and works of art were covered in black crape, and the clocks did not tick. All colours were muted. Shutters pinned back against the windows obscured the outside, and the only light came from the spirit herself, who was an infant no longer. She had transformed through the enchantment that accompanies Christmas into a beautiful woman. Was this how the baby girl would look as an adult? In her flowing movements, she had the grace of a river, yet one could tell the potential power of a storm. She glowed and floated such as a character from heaven might, but still looked earthly mortal. While her shawl was blushing with colour, her long flowing hair was translucent, the very epitome of spirituality, and it waved slowly as if she were under water. Gracefully, she noted the dark room before closing her eyes, as if remembering events that had once happened there. Pulling her hands slowly apart and leaving a trail of colour and sparkling embers in the space between them, which hung in mid-air, she whispered one word to nobody, and the phosphorescent light seemed to glow ever brighter. Come. Immediately, the colours subdivided themselves into two portions, bunched themselves together, and formed two blue spherical lights, which descended abruptly, passing through the floor as easily as the spirit rose up from her temporary cot 4 floors below. In response, and from beneath, the dreaming wraiths of the sisters rose through the floor, and after a short while gently floated before her. Their physical bodies at rest, and their consciousnesses mostly freed from their earthly conditioning, each looked about them with a mixture of trepidation and wonderment before settling on the womanly vision before them. My sisters, the spirit spoke. Am I dreaming? Asked Edwina. I must be, but oh, my toes. And I too, exclaimed Carmine. But I never dream of her. Edwina looked in the direction of her sister's voice. Why tonight? Nor I of you, and you are just as despicable as you are when I am awake. It is the disturbance, that is it. My mind is confused with the happenings of this night. I will awaken soon. Why am I dreaming of you? And who are you? Charlene asked to the silent, glowing lady who floated before her. The spirit smiled gently,
with the silent power of a winter's snowfall, and pressed a finger to her lips. Do you remember me? Do you remember how I was? Do you remember our games, our times together? I do. You are Constance. Before you became sick. Edwina glanced at her. How? Charlene glared at the spirit as well. Are you here then? Come back to teach us our lesson? My sisters, I love both of you as I have always done, and I am here to perform a miracle if you wish. In short, my sisters, God has noticed you, and for sustaining your selfless way of life, an alternative is being offered, a gift. But we allowed you to die. Did you, Edwina? Or did God desire me so greatly that he took back that which he offered this world? Constance, if this is not a dream, then what do you wish from us? I wish you to know that I forgive you, my sisters. I forgive you for being with your friends instead of returning home with my medicine. I forgive you for your youthfulness. I forgive you for your ignorance, because the extent of my illness you were not to know. I blamed her, said Charlene. I'm sorry. We thought you were in error, for Father thought... There was no error, Edwina, no mistake. What has happened to this house, Constance? Are you responsible for the lamps, the fires? What has happened is forgiveness, Charlene, the sweetest gift. Your only doorway to peace. It is time to let your conscience go, my sisters. It is time for anger to be swept away and allow clemency back into your hearts. It is time to celebrate and mend your own compassion through the symbols of gift, light, flowers, and the giving and receiving of them. It is time to give the darkness back to that which truly owns it, which is not part of your true selves. It is time to make amends and embrace peace. It is time to forgive each other, my sisters. It is time to remember who you once were and to bring a new resolve into your future lives. Where are you, Constance? I am asleep next to Mary. All is well. You are the baby child, Shannon. I am, Charlene. Come back through Providence to be with you again. Will you look after me once more? We will, enthused Edwina, suddenly making the decision of her life. Will we not, sister? Charlene suddenly sensed the immense, unknowable power of the moment. An unanticipated instant only a human can have the privilege of enjoying, and one that has the capacity of making new worlds. She nodded. We will. But how can we know this is not a simple dream? You will know, my sisters. The miracle and power of Christmas will come unto you both, and you will know. Have you not had your measure of evidence already, Edwina? Your eyes. Moreover, for further proof, come look at me when you first awake. If I smile at you both, you will know. But if I do not smile, then you will have to ask yourself, just what was this experience about? Why so long, Constance? Asked Charlene. Why now? Why this evening of all evenings? where I have been, time means nothing. The baby, whose child is it? It is God's child, Edwina. But the authorities. Christmas is a magical time, my darlings, and it is best to trust the miracle. You wish for the gift, the miracle? I do, both replied simultaneously, and then each managed a crooked smile, a smile to replace the decades of harm. Reunion, though, comes to a price, spoke Constance, her voice eerily echoing with familiarity and not without a little sorrow. Are you willing to pay? Are you willing to release that which has sustained you both for so long? Are you willing enough to unbend your crooked hearts and backs? Are you willing to feel what you have felt? For mark this, suffer it tonight for a brief, while rather than carry it before ye for the next time. For the spirit's sudden seriousness, she hesitantly received two unfamiliar, contemplative stares after the sisters had fully taken in what had been said, before two damaged indications of yes. Therefore, the spirit, once known as Constance, looked away and to the floor as the room darkened with numbness and death. Her eyes narrowed with authority as she pulled her hands upwards and began to pronounce in rhythmic words the Lord's Prayer. Inexplicably, as if pulled by a living magnet, Charlene and Edwina floated until they became positioned behind their sister, whose poetic voice was now becoming so loud that both sisters in their absent-mindedness feared that she would wake the household. The power of her expression was disquieting as it rose in volume. A fearful presence then entered the room abruptly. It was not possible to say with any certainty from which direction it came, or even how long it took for the aura to fully arrive, but it appeared as a terrible veiled shadow. Pressed on the point, and discussing it later, the sisters would agree that it appeared to be emanating from everywhere. The floor, the furniture, and even the pale and discoloured wallpaper. It manifested as a tortured face, a feeling of bleakness, a transparent charm, and a lamentable pain that echoed across time. It surrounded them as a foul smell left after a battle, and sounded like the growling of 1,000 mouths. Its crudeness took what little control the sisters had left and squeezed and penetrated their souls until fat tears of grief and anguish dripped uncontrollably down their faces. Constance's words streamed relentlessly onwards, directed mostly towards the floor, and the louder she intoned, the deeper and more concentrated the darkness became as all light fled the room. As thick as the fog which still hung about in some deeper pockets of London, her repeated chant now seemed to have a dual function, for the leaden dark began to coalesce, forming mucky, flowerless lumps in front of them, defying even gravity itself. A quivering, high vibration sounded throughout, stinging the sisters' ears. Constance did not waver, though, in her intention, and even though both sisters felt threatened and unsettled, it was clear to them that whatever the spirit was doing, she was still in charge of the cheerless energy. Only that thought sustained them, until Constance herself faltered as if the task began to overcome her. Her outstretched arms wavered, and for the first time Charlene and Edwina could see that it was the position of them that was keeping the darkness in some form of order. The cloudy mass now broke through her spiritual white shell, and dark like arid smoke might rise from burning manure began to drift away from the bulk of it. Spirit-like, the sisters could not do anything but stare, while the spirit of her sister looked to be overcome by what she had created. It seemed as if the power and strength of the darkness was too much for even her to control. Constance closed her mouth for a short while, appearing to withdraw into a deeper trance, but it was only for a few heartbeats, for when she opened them and began to speak again, many parts of the shadow which was now emerging from every part of the house was exacted back into order, and the process of cleaning continued as the sisters wept. Shortly, the resonance of sound and light changed, and it was unnerving. It sounded like a powerful wind, but one heard from a great distance. The worst thing about it was that it gave them the impression that it was always heading in their direction. There was a taste which neither Charlene or Edwina could place until Charlene's stomach came up with the answer. But it was like eating chocolate under seawater, she confessed much later. Such is the taste of violence and damnation, hurt and blame. When fully collated and formed, the evil object floating in front of Constance was opaque and gloomily malignant. It had no real shape to speak of, and visually seemed quite harmless. But it floated in front of them. It issued evilness like the sun issued goodness. There was no intelligence about it, yet it influenced Constance's spirit, causing her to stutter in her intention. Its black radiance was overpowering, and Charlene and Edwina sank away as much as they could. Sisters, these are the essence of your thoughts made manifest during these last 50 sad years. Your tears are the price you pay for feeling them once again so strongly. Our thoughts, wept Edwina. I do not comprehend. This is the quintessence of your thoughts, my darlings. You believe yourself to be so separate, do you not? You imagine that every time you had a vile thought, nothing became of it. Nothing is lost. Nothing goes away. This is the totality, my sisters, exclusively of what you thought of each other. Each image, each assumption, and each opinion and feeling. These convictions collecting in every pocket, every nook and cranny, every floorboard and hearth, every brick, carpet and fibre. They have been saturating and dethroning this gay house since I left it all these years ago, now so concentrated. It is my place, my duty, to release and send them to a place where their transformation awaits. Where is that? Constance smiled as she further compressed it to resemble a dark and unreflecting ball. In the earth, Charlene. It longs to go there. Its home is there. It too is tired of being what it is and wishes to be reborn. It is used again to remain there, joyless and soulless as it is. It is an affront against heaven and all that is good. Then let it go, sister, spoke Charlene. Away with it, and I'll cause it no more darkness to utter from my lips. She glanced desperately at Edwina, who nodded with an equal amount of enthusiasm. Constance did not need to see their accord. She simply closed her eyes again and returned to repeating loud the same prayer. As she continued, Edwina and Charlene gazed on impartially as the once fetid and chilled mass became compressed until it was the size of a football, and then a tennis ball, and then to the bulk of a marble, reduced even more until Constance held the final size in the palm of her hand. It became nothing less than a silhouette against the darkness of the room, reflecting nothing. Now lowering her voice, Charlene gently declared it was time for it to return, that the mistake was rectified. Yet it was as if she were talking to thin air, for she neither looked at the sisters nor the unpolished sphere. As Charlene turned her palms downward, the spherical dark matter left the room as oddly as it had arrived. It approached the floor slowly, but then appeared to be sucked away with increasing speed in a direction the sisters could not identify. Then it vanished, and a radiant light appeared to the room. Almost all of it emanated from the spirit of their sister herself. However, it was not so much the light they could see, but the lightness they could feel, which took them by surprise. Emotionally, there was a change of Bobdiganian proportions, as if the entire house, inside and out, roof and cellars, had been painted from black to white. As Charlene would later recall, it was akin to the excitement a child feels when waking up on Christmas Day itself. The spirit, though, was all business after she had completed her purpose, and partly turned to her two sisters. Only then, for the very first time, did they realize that they were able to see through her, as if she were made of gossamer thread or the finest white Japanese silk, and understood too that it was only her love and forgiveness that had made the experience happen. Constance lifted her arms again and parted the air as she had done before, but this time her entire form began to glow until she had the quality of iridescent gold. "Look after me, my sister darlings," she repeated as she smilingly descended to the floor through which she passed. "Look after me well." As if a candle were extinguished, she vanished, and the room returned to its normal drabness. With much abasement, the sisters looked at each other, still not knowing or sure if it were a hallucination. Each knew they were having some new type of experience, some new form of delusion, but neither knew how to wake themselves up from it. Now left alone, the peace, the love, and the forgiveness they had experienced slowly began to take on the appearance of an illusion. Without the magic of light and the glowing figure, all that remained was an indistinct, dreamy feeling of detachment. "Preposterous," muttered Edwina suddenly, at the same time as she gave herself a hefty pinch on her arm. "Come on," she continued. "Wake up! Wake up!" Charlene, less frantic, stared at her sister dolefully, then spoke. "I do believe we are here, Eddie. I don't believe this is a dream." Perhaps it was the use of her shortened name, a name not used by anyone since childhood, but unhurriedly a glorious moment of unwholesome realization expressed itself over their faces. Yes, perhaps it was that, or the way she said the sentence. But at exactly that moment, Charlene and Edwina woke up with an energy which caused their bedroom clothes to jump into the air. Both sat upright in bed, and Dash took the opportunity to comfort her mistress by nuzzling himself under Charlene's right hand, which automatically found the softness of his fur and began to absent-mindedly stroke it as she stared at her ceiling, now completely covered with green and red decorations. But barely for a few moments, because then she remembered everything. And she dreamingly attended to that unusual experience. Her hand happened to touch something that she had never felt before. Not comprehending this at all, she grasped Dash by his shoulders and lifted him up to eye height, where her eyes opened wide. Catching her breath loudly, she stared weakly at Dash's fourth and complete hind leg as the animal wiggled gently in front of him. "Oh, my word," she said, first gently and then louder. "Oh, my word! Oh, my word!" Still in her nightclothes, she hurried from her room, followed by an excited and barking Dash, and fled up to the 4th floor, where she was joined by Edwina moments later. As the woman stood mutely in her hallway outside their dead sister's old bedroom, both of them gradually became aware of the ceiling, mostly because of the fragrance it emitted. Together, as one person, they looked upwards and were astonished to see hundreds of intertwined flowers attached to the ceiling, interweaved with the Christmas decorations, as had happened in the basement, and which were now appearing all over the house. Their beautiful fragrance was overwhelming and decisive. Charlene held out her hand, and it was warmly taken by Edwina. "Sister, Edie, would I be right in believing you have had the same experience as myself this night? I have had a dream like no other, Charlene, and I am glad to speak. It has been a lifetime. Oh, merry, merry Christmas, sister." An unavoidable moment of pleasure occurred, and they embraced, patting each other on their shoulders. "We have no need to carry on our squabble. I have no wish to at all, my sister. Oh, merry, merry Christmas then, merry Christmas. You remember this was Constance's room, and that is why the baby's spirit chose it, do you think? We have had the same experience. I can think of no other reason. She should have it once more, do you think? It must be arranged soon, my sister. Oh, how wonderful it is to say that word. Yes, the little child must stay. She asked us to look after her, did she not? But look, it is near morning. Look, the darkness will soon leave and the fog cleared. Is that snow I see? Come see, my darling." Together they looked out to a happy view of roofs and chimneys that were being dusted with snow, visible by the approaching dawn. "A happy Christmas, Edwina, and the same to you, sister. Should we see our sister? Miss Pitkin will have a fit to see us together. Aha! She won't be the only one." Joyfully, the women linked arms and again embraced. Tears flowed. 50 years of unshed tears. Mary, the undermaid, had the unpleasant duty of being the first of the servants to rise. She had the task of boiling water for tea, and always took a cup firstly into cook's room. However, on that Christmas morning, things were to take a very different turn. Mary, although being unable to sleep like death itself, after working for up to 15 hours a day on occasions, needed no alarm, and she woke naturally and peacefully. However, the stillness of her quarters were broken after she raised herself, for the baby had vanished from her crib. Confused, she pelted along to Miss Pitkin's room, whereupon she banged noisily on her door until a very flustered housekeeper her head hanging off to one side in an odd manner, opened it. "Oh, madam, she's gone." "Gone? What are you talking about, child? Who has gone?" "The baby, Miss Pipkin, the baby, gone from my side, gone from my room, gone." Miss Pipkin ran her hand through her flaming and untidy hair in bewilderment, because at that time of the morning she had almost forgotten that there was actually a baby in the house at all. Then she became fully conscious and steadied herself in her usual manner against the door frame. She was about to say something sensible and depreciating when a familiar, but considering the time and the place, unusual voice became singing down the hallway. After their jubilant reunion, and while enjoying every sight, sound and smell coming from the hundreds of flowers and the thousands of pieces of decorations which now lined the house on every floor, and accompanied by the quietness of the early morning, the sisters had crept downstairs and taken the baby from her crib in Mary's room ever so carefully, so as not to wake her. "Ah, Miss Pipkin, hush now, please. We have her asleep." When Miss Pipkin turned to face that voice, she was forced to steady herself even more against the frame, because next to Edwina was Charlene, with both their faces sporting gigantic, idiotic grins. "Can you smell those flowers, ladies? And just look at those garlands. What a glorious fragrance to have on a day such as this. Do you not agree?" Miss Pipkin's mouth opened, but no sound emerged, and although she did have the presence of mind to pull her nightdress around herself, Mary, though, was not so surprised at the two sisters standing together, arms linked, enjoying each other's company, but was more than relieved when she noticed the baby in Charlene's arms. "Madam, what flowers?" The sisters looked upwards at the same moment, and Miss Pipkin and Mary's eyes followed their gaze upwards until they too saw the fresh flowers, impossible flowers for the time of year, roses, daffodils, carnations, crocuses, lilies and orchids, flooded and clung to the ceiling, and like the decorations that had appeared in other parts of the house, as dense as a Devon forest floor in springtime. "It is not possible," breathed Miss Pipkin. But here is the child, Mary. Worry not. We gathered her up where you were asleep," said Ina wickedly, as she bounced forward like a child herself and playfully tapped the housemaid on her nose with her forefinger. "Such a sweet child, such a gorgeous child. We could not wait to see her, for now we know who she is and why she is here. And is this not the finest time of the year, ladies? It is snowing out in the world, and we have a child to care for, our loving sister to care for. And what else in the world could be better than that?" "Indeed, madam," Miss Pipkin recovered. "Madam, what is happening?" "Happening?" cried Charlene. "Why, it is Christmas Day, Miss Pipkin, the Lord's Day, when wishes are granted and favours are deepened and forgiveness is established. That is what kind of day it is, and that day is today." Glancing at each other, and almost as if they were reading each other's thoughts, like all good twins and triplets are supposed to do, as one person the ladies disappeared into the warm kitchen, offering each other a glance of confusion. Miss Pipkin and Mary hurried after them, their white nightdresses billowing all the way from them like sailing ships. Moreover, all the while flowers and decorations continued to arrange themselves into breathtaking patterns all around and above, making the most delicious and soothing popping noises. The sisters were a picture postcard of Christmas happiness and goodwill, chuckling in front of a roaring fire of crackling pine cones and holly branches, toasting herself and looking as pleased as Punch. Edwina was holding the baby high, as a miser might hold his gold, or a nun her virtue. Mary stared at the fire in wonderment. Who had lit it? Around them as well wafted the most delicious of Christmas smells, even though nothing was cooking. Turkey, roasted potatoes, garlands of hemlock, drinks of cinnamon, cranberry and apple made their nostrils twitch and their mouths salivate. And still the decorations and flowers kept popping into existence, and each time one did, someone's eyes would undoubtedly travel to the ceiling to see what was what. Moreover, all around them still candles and lamps burnt so strongly that every nook and corner of the large kitchen was lit so brightly that nothing could hide, even if it wanted to. The light of Christmas illuminated all. Invited to sit around the kitchen fire, Miss Pitkin and Mary were waved over, while Edwina's attention was wholeheartedly given over to the baby. Charlene fussed around and clumsily brewed a pot of tea as she chatted. This caught the servants off guard. "Miss Pipkin," said Charlene, finally turning to her, "I do believe you are owed an explanation." "Well, madam, if you feel the need, I am too astounded to venture an opinion about what it is all about." Charlene began their story and gave a brief but sorrowful account of how their mother had given birth to triplets, not twins. In a soft and humble voice, interjected occasionally by Edwina, she explained how their middle sister had become ill, and how they had been charged with the duty of purchasing her medicine, and how, when they had failed to accomplish that task within the time ordered by her physician, she had died in the most tragic manner. They had described in painful words how one sister began to accuse another, and how that was the start of their bitter feud. Now they patted each other's arms as they further related about their experience and about the miracle that had happened in the night, to the ever more extreme and continuing amazement of Miss Pitkin, for she had never witnessed absolution between two people so sincerely before. "Therefore she shall live with us again, Miss Pitkin," smiled Edwina, "and she shall have her own room again. We shall see to it both morally and legally." "Oh, madam," cried Miss Pitkin, "I feel like crying. It is as beautiful a story as it is outside, madam. Look at the snow." Outside the world was hushed, as heavy, large snowflakes silently fluttered against the windows. It was clear that it was going to be hard to get to church later on that day. "That is wonderful, Miss Pitkin, but we have to remember that real beauty is within us," spoke Charlene solemnly. "If only I had known I had spent so many years doing good deeds that I ignored the one good thing that I could achieve right on my own doorstep. If you will excuse the witticism." "Oh, madam!" Miss Pitkin stared in wonder at Dash, as she realized that the dog now had 4 legs instead of 3. "How?" Charlene lifted the creature up and brought him close to her happy face, which Dash did his best to clean with huge, soppy, excited licks. "I am not questioning today, Miss Pitkin. We have seen too many miracles. I question not the hand of God on this day." "Yes, the time for recriminations has passed, has it not? Let us enjoy now, and look ahead, and that is not so utterly strange, would you not agree? I would now believe anything on this day, Miss Edwina, anything." Both Miss Pitkin and Mary could not stop staring at Dash. "I said, look ahead, and you know that is what I can do," said Edwina. "I can see clearly, as I used to. No more need for that cane. Is that not another miracle? You used to have poor eyesight, sister? Indeed, Charlene, my vision was degrading monthly. But now it has been restored to fullness." Madam, how many miracles can we have in one day? Asked Miss Pitkin, alternatively looking from Dash to the ceiling. I think we have had enough to last us a lifetime. However, as if Providence itself were listening, there were a double knock at the outside kitchen door. Glancing across to the little clock over the mantelpiece, as if some ivy leaves were beginning to curl around it, and puzzled as to who would be knocking so early on Christmas morning, Miss Pitkin walked across and opened it, revealing Lucy, her sister, covered with head to toe in large flakes of snow. Not waiting to be invited in, she smiled apologetically and briefly as she swept into the kitchen, bringing with her a large quantity of cold air. "Lucy!" Miss Pitkin exclaimed. "What are you... Oh, Holly, I'm so sorry for..." It was then that she spotted the gathering, and that made her stop and curtsy. "Oh, heavens, I do apologise. I thought my sister would be alone. I'll go." "Nonsense, my child," smiled Edwina. "Come in and speak your cheer. We are all friends here. A merry, merry Christmas to you, I must say." "And I echo that," smiled Charlene. "Here is a chair, my dear, and take a cup of tea. It's brewing well. I made it." "You made it, madam?" Lucy glanced from face to face, trying to make sense of it all, but could not. Then her eyes went to the ceiling, and they opened wide, for she had never seen so many decorations. She caught her breath. "Well, I'm so blessed. Holly, I am bursting. Let me come to the point. I am here to offer my apologies and to wish you a Merry Christmas and to offer you this because I feel so terrible about our quarrel." She lifted up the single parcel she had under her arm, brushed off the snow and offered it to Miss Pitkin, who took it with a smile on her face, for she knew already what it could be. "This is not your Christmas present, sister. That's to come this evening." Miss Pitkin's eyes filled with sisterly love as she lifted out her chosen bonnet and held it. "On your head, Miss Pitkin. That's where it goes," said Edwina. "Oh, madam." "Allow me." Charlene, and without her permission, removed it from her slim hands and placed it just so, at the correct angle on her head. "I'm so sorry that I bought it when I knew you had set on your heart. Will you ever forgive me?" Miss Pitkin looked at the glowing faces of Charlene and Edwina, and, encouraged by their nodding, spoke quietly. "What is there to forgive, sister? You have done nothing wrong. What a time this is! It will be the best Christmas I am ever, I'm sure." Suddenly, from Mr. and Mrs. White's room, only 3 doors along, came a stifled feminine cry, followed by a deeper one. Spontaneously, the sisters, Miss Pitkin and Mary, began to laugh. "I do believe Cook has woken up. They probably spied the decorations," said Charlene, picking up the teapot. And because the excitement was too much, and after she had gaily stood and twirled, Mary gently took the baby from Edwina and hugged her with a genuine love that made the sisters smile. "Charlene, our new sister will need a nurse, will she not?" Edwina said sweetly. "I do believe so, Edwina. I do believe so." Charlene smiled, while looking fondly at their maid while stirring the pot. "Are you up for the position, Mary? You seem affectionate with her." "Oh, madam, I don't know what to say, but thank you, madam, thank you." "Then the position of nursemaid is yours, young Mary. And later on, governess, perhaps," added Edwina. "Congratulations. And you must have an increase, of course, a proper woman's wages." "Oh, madam, I will not let you down. I'll look after her day and night and night and day." "I'm sure you will, my child. And now let us try and get this probably disgusting brew I have attempted. No, Mrs. Pitkin, you sit there looking resplendent in your new hat. I'll pour." Therefore, virtue came to that household locked and bound in snow. Whenever it left, weeks later, it did not take anything with it except the promise of its return the same time next year. Mary was as good to her word as any nursemaid could be, and she attended to Constance even though she married herself off some years later. However, as her chosen chap became a footman to the sisters in their extreme old age, it was a happy arrangement. Miss Pitkin eventually became housekeeper to Miss Constance, as the child became the beneficiary of the sisters' wills. She grew to be as beautiful as her former self had been, and with the added bonus of her sister's amenable and philanthropic attitude, she became much revered by the local community. As for the sisters themselves, while they lived, they joined forces and pursued their vision of a healthier and cleaner London for the less fortunate. At a late stage in their life, they finally understood that true love rests in numbers, and if that number is more than one, then the spirit and joy of Christmas can occur every day.